Chapter 4738. The three temple masters gave the order, and the fleet sped up to chase after the Heaven and Earth Lord. After another 15 minutes, the fleet finally caught up with the Heaven and Earth Lord. The two were less than 30,000 miles apart. This time the soldiers controlling the warships were on high alert. They had already formed a defensive shield around the warships, so they were not afraid of the Heaven and Earth Lord's sudden attack. Under the control of the many soldiers, the warships accumulated a vast amount of power. They all opened their divine cannons and locked onto the Heaven and Earth Lord. The Heaven and Earth Lord, who was rushing with all his might, felt immense pressure. He immediately tensed up. Of course, he knew that there was no way he could dodge the three warships firing at him at the same time. With the power of the three warships, even if they could not kill him on the spot, they could severely injure him and cause his strength to drop greatly. Therefore, the Heaven and Earth Lord decisively chose to escape and temporarily avoid the attack. Knowing that the other party outnumbered him and that his reinforcements had not arrived, he did not want to tangle with the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. Zhoush. He decisively left the pursuing team and teleported 40,000 miles to the side, hoping to escape the fleet's pursuit. Boom, boom, boom. With a series of dull explosions, the three warships simultaneously spewed out divine power pillars. They carried the power to destroy the heavens and earth as they blasted toward the Heaven and Earth Lord's location. The world within tens of thousands of miles was illuminated, and violent divine power fluctuations spread far and wide. However, the thousands of dazzling light pillars all missed their target and bombarded the ground and the mountain range. More than 10 mountain ranges and 30,000 miles of land were reduced to ruins. Thick smoke and dust surged between heaven and earth. Even though dozens of light pillars brushed past the Heaven and Earth Lord, they didn't cause any harm to him. All they did was shatter his protective divine light. Damn foreign race bastards. When my reinforcements arrive, I'll teach you a lesson. The Heaven and Earth Lord flew forward, turning his head to glare at the three warships and cursing fiercely. Within the three warships, the three temple masters' expressions turned ugly when they saw that the warships' attacks had missed. They scolded their subordinates. However, they did not plan to continue pursuing the Heaven and Earth Lord. Since the Heaven and Earth Lord had tactfully moved aside and had no intention of attacking or obstructing the fleet, they would temporarily spare his life. Whoosh. The fleet gradually increased its speed to chase after the god-slaying battleship. The first palace master had already used his divine sense to detect that there was a warship flying at high speed 360,000 kilometers ahead. The battleship didn't have any emblems, and its shape and style were different from the Taiyu Shrines. It should be the battleship of the alien god emperor. As time passed, 6 hours later, the distance between the fleet and the god-slaying battleship gradually shortened from 360,000 li to 280,000 li. At this time, White Dragon, who was piloting the god-slaying battleship, still hadn't discovered the Taiyu Shrine's fleet and was still flying at the same speed as before. Meanwhile, Ji Tianxing was recuperating in the distorted spacetime of the Nine Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda. He was unaware of the outside world for the time being. But there was one thing that was more interesting. Heaven and Earth Lord avoided the Taiyu Shrine fleet, but it did not give up on chasing the god-slaying battleship. It only changed its route and continued to chase after them from the left side of the fleet's route, about 80,000 kilometers away. Now the Taiyu Shrine's fleet had caught up to it and was on par with it. Both sides were chasing after the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. They were on the same line, just 80,000 kilometers apart. Since Heaven and Earth Lord could monitor the fleet, the three palace masters on the battleship could also monitor Heaven and Earth Lord's every move. Of course, this situation was only temporary. The fleet's speed was faster than Heaven and Earth Lord's. The distance between the two was bound to widen. The three palace masters still didn't think much of Heaven and Earth Lord, but the soldiers under them didn't dare to be careless. They were still on guard against Heaven and Earth Lord, maintaining their vigilance at all times. As for Heaven and Earth Lord, it was laughing coldly in its heart. My reinforcements are about to arrive. You're dead meat. As expected. In a short 15 minutes, the god-slaying battleship at the front of the fleet encountered an unexpected situation. White Dragon was piloting the god-slaying battleship to the east. Suddenly, it saw a dazzling god-slaying light in the sky ahead of it. The dazzling god-slaying light only used a few breaths' time to travel from 80,000 kilometers away to 50,000 kilometers away from the battleship. White Dragon instantly understood that it wasn't the Taiyu Shrine's battleship, but the God Emperor of the beast race. He hurriedly controlled the array to speed up the god-slaying battleship's escape. It also dodged 20,000 kilometers to the right. At the same time, he hurriedly woke up Ji Tianxing, who was recuperating in the god-slaying pagoda. "Master, there's another God Emperor attacking. It should be the beast race." In the distorted space-time of the god-slaying pagoda, Ji Tianxing was busy recuperating. Previously he had fought for 2 days and a few hours. He had already been recuperating in the distorted space-time for close to 4 months. Now his injuries had stabilized and he had recovered 70%. He had the strength to fight again. After hearing White Dragon's report, he hurriedly stopped recuperating and left Jiutian 10 Absolute's pagoda. Swoosh! With a flash of white light, Ji Tianxing appeared in the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship. There was no need for White Dragon to report anything. He immediately released his divine sense to investigate the situation around him. When his divine sense spread out, the first thing he detected was the divine light that was charging toward him from the left. In the multicolored divine light that was like a cloud, there was a giant beast that was as black as ink and exuded a chilling aura. It exuded the majestic aura of a god emperor. White Dragon's guess was right. It was indeed the god emperor of the beast race. Moreover, Ji Tianxing could also tell that it was a mid-level god emperor. Its strength was no weaker than the heaven and earth overlord of the beast race. Immediately after, his divine sense spread out more than 20,000 kilometers and sensed the existence of 3 battleships. The auras of the 3 emperor-level battleships were very powerful. They were arranged in a formation and seemed to be well-trained and well-coordinated. Ji Tianxing's expression changed on the spot. His pupils constricted and his gaze became serious. "It's the Taiyu Shrine. The fleet formed by the 3 Palace Masters' battleships is about to catch up?" He had never expected that the Taiyu Shrine's fleet would catch up to him after escaping with all his might and finally entering the unknown land. The speed of the fleet and the precision of their tracking made him feel incredulous. He could immediately determine that there must be a core figure of the Taiyu Shrine in the 3 battleships. It was either the 2nd Palace Master or the 1st Palace Master himself. Only these 2 key figures had such strength and means. His divine sense had also detected that the heaven and earth overlord was also doing his best to catch up tens of thousands of kilometers to the left of the fleet. But in comparison, the threat that the 2 beast race overlords brought to him was far less than the 3 battleships. Chapter 4739. What should I do? The beast race god emperor was attacking from the front, and the Taiyu Shrine's fleet was chasing after him from behind. Ji Tianxing's current situation was truly hanging by a thread. It was extremely dangerous. He frowned as he pondered. A cold glint flashed across his eyes. At this moment, the pitch-black beast on the left was only 30,000 miles away from the god-slaying battleship. It was the overlord of the beast race in the north of this unknown land. Its name was Dark Wilderness. Dark Wilderness Overlord was at the middle stage of the God Emperor. It had condensed 6 Taoist rhymes and was one of the stronger overlords. It was also because of this that it was able to arrive at the battlefield faster than the other overlord. Previously, when the Heaven and Earth overlord had sent it a message, it had explained the situation of the enemy battleship. Therefore, after it discovered the god-slaying battleship, it locked onto it. Now that it was 30,000 miles away, it exploded with an earth-shattering aura. It waved its huge claws and shot out 3 crescent-shaped light blades toward the god-slaying battleship. Swish, 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 swish. The 3 crescent-shaped light blades were extremely fast. They instantly streaked across the sky and arrived in front of the god-slaying battleship. However, the White Dragon was already prepared. It had already activated the god-slaying battleship's defensive light barrier and dodged. Unfortunately, the crescent-shaped light blades were too fast. The god-slaying battleship dodged one of them but was still hit by 2 of them. Boom. Crack. The 2 crescent-shaped light blades struck the god-slaying battleship at the same time. There was a deafening explosion that spread across tens of thousands of miles. Countless fragments of divine light exploded and splashed in all directions, raining down in a voluminous manner. Not only did the 2 crescent-shaped light blades collapse, but even the god-slaying battleship's divine light barrier was mostly shattered. The powerful impact pushed the god-slaying battleship thousands of miles away. It rolled a few times before it stabilized. Then the white dragon controlled the god-slaying battleship and sped up. At this time he definitely wouldn't tangle with the Dark Wilderness Overlord to prevent the Taiyu Shrine's fleet from catching up. The Dark Wilderness Overlord used a divine power to push the god-slaying battleship back thousands of miles, successfully delaying it for 2 breaths of time. Just as it was about to unleash its divine abilities and secret techniques to launch a fierce attack on the god-slaying battleship, it realized that the god-slaying battleship had no intention of fighting back. It had actually sped up and fled. Didn't Qian say that there were 2 god emperors in this battleship? Why didn't you fight with us? Why did you run away without hesitation? Isn't he too cowardly? The Underworld Lord muttered in his heart, feeling that this matter was a little strange. Where's Qian? Isn't it following this battleship? Thinking of the Heaven and Earth Overlord, it released its divine perception to scan the surroundings, searching for traces of the Heaven and Earth Overlord. Sure enough, it soon found the Qian Lord, who was hundreds of thousands of miles behind him. At the same time, it also discovered the 3 battleships belonging to the Taiyu Shrine. Reality proved that Heaven and Earth Overlord was not lying. That was indeed a battleship from the Taiyu Shrine. As expected, the Taiyu Shrine sent out 4 battleships to form a fleet to invade the unknown lands. While the Lord of the Underworld was furious, he also felt more and more puzzled. That's even more strange. The Taiyu Shrine sent out 4 battleships, which means that at least 4 palace masters are here. There's only me and Qian here, so why don't they dare to fight? As these thoughts flashed through his mind, the Lord of the Underworld did not forget to chase after the god-slaying battleship. On the other side, the 3 palace masters of the fleet also saw the Lord of the Underworld and the scene of it attacking the god-slaying battleship. This surprised the 3 palace masters. They thought to themselves, the Heaven and Earth Overlord actually called for reinforcements? Looking at the appearance of that giant beast, it should be the Lord of the Underworld. The Lord of the Underworld attacked the God Emperor's battleship and successfully delayed the God Emperor's footsteps. This is creating an opportunity for us. Now that things had developed to this point, the 3 palace masters were even more confident that they could catch Ji Tianqing in a short period of time. Soon another half an hour passed. The chasing team crossed thousands of mountains and rivers, and the distance between them was still shrinking. The Lord of the Underworld gave chase with all its might. It was still more than 30,000 miles away from the god-slaying battleship, and it would soon be able to launch another attack. The Taiyu Shrine's fleet was only 120,000 miles away from the god-slaying battleship. The Lord of the Heaven and Earth's speed was slightly slower, and the Taiyu Shrine's fleet was 50,000 miles away. But at this time Ji Tianqing and the White Dragon encountered a new danger. A dazzling divine light appeared in the front right of the god-slaying battleship, and it rushed over as fast as lightning. Within that divine light was a giant beast that was 30 meters tall and looked like a unicorn. Its entire body was covered in dark golden scales, and the horn on its head was like a dragon's horn, shining with golden light. 2 broad wings grew from its shoulders and they flapped rapidly. With each flap it could fly thousands of miles away. As it flew with all its might, it left a long trail of flames behind it. Divine light flickered, and it emitted the aura of a God Emperor expert. Without a doubt, this was another God Emperor expert of the beast race. At the same time, it was also the 3rd overlord of the unknown lands, the Golden Horse. Of course, the Golden Horse was just a name, not the name of its race. The Golden Horse Overlord was also an intermediate God Emperor, but it had only condensed 5 Taoist rhymes, so it was slightly weaker than the Underworld Overlord. Even so, it still locked onto the god-slaying battleship with murderous intent, and its entire body emitted terrifying killing intent. When it was only 30,000 miles away from the god-slaying battleship, it also attacked without hesitation like the Underworld Overlord. It flapped its broad wings, releasing thousands of divine light blades, and began to attack the god-slaying battleship. It opened its bloody mouth and spat out 10 pillars of divine fire, which fiercely bombarded the god-slaying battleship. It used all its strength to release these divine abilities and spell techniques, and their power was extremely terrifying. However, when it appeared, Ji Tianqing and the White Dragon discovered it. Therefore, when it attacked, Ji Tianqing and the White Dragon had already made a countermeasure. On one hand, the white dragon controlled the god-slaying battleship and condensed a powerful defensive barrier. On the other hand, Ji Tianxing also made a move in time. He waved the barrier of heaven and slashed out a dozen sword lights that could split heaven and earth apart to meet the Golden Horse Overlord's attack. Boom! Rumble! In the next moment, the sky full of divine light blades and flaming light pillars collided with the dozen or so giant swords, and a deafening sound burst out. Most of the divine light blades and flaming light pillars were defeated and dissolved. The dozen or so giant swords that Ji Tianxing slashed out also collapsed and shattered. The remaining few divine light blades and flaming light pillars hit the god-slaying battleship, but they were also blocked by the divine light barrier. This time the divine light barrier was not destroyed and only a few cracks and dents were left. The god-slaying battleship shook violently a few times before quickly calming down, and its flying speed did not decrease at all. The Golden Horse Overlord's interception and attack did not have much of an effect. It only delayed the god-slaying battleship for a breath of time, which made the Golden Horse Overlord feel a little depressed. It was unwilling to accept this, and it was also afraid that the Underworld Overlord and the Heaven and Earth Overlord would laugh at it, so it angrily chased after the god-slaying battleship and continued to attack and kill. Chapter 4740. With the Golden Horse Overlord's strength, it would be difficult for him to catch up to the Godslayer warship in a short period of time. However, he persevered and followed closely behind the Godslayer warship, ready to attack at any time. The pursuit team became more complicated. Not only were there 3 divine warships from the Taiyu Shrine, but there were also 3 God-Emperor powerhouses of the Orc race. Moreover, the distance between these powerhouses and the warship was rapidly closing. A fierce battle could break out at any time. Ji Tianxing knew that whether it was the 3 divine warships from the Taiyu Shrine or the 3 God-Emperor of the Orc race, they were all his opponents. The 3 temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine also knew that their target was Ji Tianxing, not the 3 God-Emperor of the Orc race. Of course, if the 3 God-Emperor of the Orc race dared to stop them, they would not be polite. However, the 3 Orc race overlords still did not understand the situation. They thought that Ji Tianxing's Godslayer warship was the same as the 3 divine warships, which were all from the Taiyu Shrine. Therefore they were under great pressure. While chasing, they did not forget to send messages to discuss countermeasures. They were also worried that if the 4 divine warships surrounded them and attacked them with all their strength, what would they do? The result was obvious. This special team was on guard against each other during the pursuit. They were all very cautious and vigilant. Ji Tianxing was fine. He only cared about moving forward with all his strength. However, the 3 God-Emperor of the Orc race's feelings were very complicated. They had already seen that the 4 divine warships of the Taiyu Shrine had invaded an unknown place at the same time. They must have an unknown purpose. No matter how strong the other party was, they could not endure and retreat. They had to intercept them. Even if they could not win, they had to think of a way to minimize the losses and harm to the Orc race. Not long after, the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine was faster and gradually approached the Underworld Lord and the Golden Horse Overlord. Although the 3 temple masters' target was the Godslayer warship and did not want to be entangled with the God-Emperor of the Orc race too much. However, both sides were on the same level and were too close to each other. This made Underworld and Golden Horse Overlord feel an intense pressure and danger. Yu Huang and Golden Horse Overlord finally couldn't bear it any longer. After discussing secretly with each other, they attacked at the same time, releasing their divine skills that could destroy heaven and earth, blasting towards the 3 battleships. Swish, swish. Dazzling divine light flared up, covering the sky and the sun. Countless divine light blades, ice flames poured down like a flood, swallowing the 3 battleships. Fortunately, the soldiers operating the 3 warships were prepared. Not only did they form a defensive shield, but they also activated the divine cannons at the critical moment, releasing hundreds of divine light beams. Boom boom boom. In the next moment, more than 1,000 pillars of divine power collided with the sharp blades of divine light in the sky, producing a deafening explosion. The fragments of divine light that filled the sky exploded and rained down like a torrential downpour. The violent impact turned into rings of 5-colored ripples that spread out in all directions. The defensive shields of the 3 divine warships were also shattered and collapsed on the spot. The attacks of the two beast race god emperor didn't cause any substantial damage to the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. However, the three palace masters couldn't bear the provocation of the beast race god emperor. No matter what, they had to fight back. They couldn't just swallow their anger. Reckless fools, kill them. Those two idiots will always hinder us. Let's just kill them. The first palace master and second palace master were filled with anger as they gave the order. The soldiers operating the battleships hurriedly complied and activated the divine robes on the battleships, initiating the attack. In order to neutralize the attack of the two beast race god emperor, the three divine warships had already released their divine robes. This time not only did the divine cannons fire, but the three battleships also released destructive lightning beams and endless divine flames. The sky was covered and the dazzling divine light enveloped a radius of 30,000 miles. At the same time, the destructive divine light beams and divine technique attacks locked onto the auras of the two beast race god emperor. Even though the underworld lord and golden horse lord sensed the danger and the threat of death and hurriedly fled and dodged, it was useless. Boom boom boom. In the next moment, divine light pillars and divine ability attacks covered the sky and covered the earth, drowning the figures of the two lords. Their divine power shields were shattered into pieces, and countless divine light shards flew everywhere. The incomparably violent impact sent them flying, tumbling several thousand miles away. Even though they dodged most of the attacks, they were still injured. Plop, plop. The Dark Wilderness Horde Lord and the Golden Horse Horde Lord crashed into a mountain range, smashing the towering mountain peak. Both of them were covered in dust and they were in a sorry state. They even spat out a few mouthfuls of blood. However, they didn't dare to waste any time. They hurriedly flew out of the ruins and accelerated into the distance. The three battleships of the Taiyu Shrine chased after them. After closing the distance, they were about to launch another attack. The Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord were already injured. How could they dare to resist the attacks of the three divine battleships? They could only deviate from their forward route and fly to the side, hoping to escape the pursuit of the three battleships. In this way, they gave up chasing after the god-slaying battleships and focused on saving their lives. In the three battleships of the Taiyu Shrine, the soldiers operating the battleships were in a dilemma. Just now, the three temple masters had given the order to kill the Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord as soon as possible and get rid of these two troublesome fellows. However, before that, the fleet's primary goal was to chase after the god-slaying battleships. Now that the Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord had changed their escape route, should the fleet continue to chase after them? If they chased after them, they would definitely delay and increase the distance between them and the god-slaying battleships. However, if they didn't chase after them, they could only watch them escape. The soldiers hesitated for a moment, and the speed of the three battleships naturally slowed down. However, the generals suddenly came to a realization and thought of a problem. Since the three temple masters didn't say anything, it meant that, before the three temple masters gave a new order, they had to obey the previous order. Therefore, the soldiers operated the three battleships and accelerated to chase after the Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord. 20 breaths later, both sides had deviated from the escape route of the god-slaying battleships, but the distance between them had narrowed. The three battleships opened fire at the same time, releasing an overwhelming divine light beam and dazzling divine light that poured down on the Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord. The Underworld Lord and Golden Horse Lord's faces changed on the spot. While they were full of fear, they couldn't help but curse. Damn it! The bastards of the Taiyu Shrine relying on a few battleships, they are actually so arrogant. If the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine fought with them, even if they lost, they could only blame themselves for being inferior. However, the other side didn't show up and only used the battleships to deal with them. This made them very unconvinced and aggrieved. Chapter 47-41. When the thousands of divine power light pillars and divine art light filled the sky, the two lords knew that the situation was hopeless. With their strength and methods, they could not stop or defeat the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. The only thing they could do now was to neutralize the enemy's attack and save their lives. Once they escaped and were out of danger, they could gather a large number of elite orcs to deal with the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. Boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, the divine skill light beams engulfed Underworld and Golden Horse Lord. Amidst a deafening muffled sound, Countless fragments of divine light burst out and scattered towards the ground like a fairy scattering flowers. The two overlords were also sent flying, tumbling several thousand miles away. However, they were prepared this time and did not suffer serious injuries. After flying for 5,000 miles, they neutralized the impact and sped up to escape into the distance. In the three warships, the soldiers in charge of operating the warships were all excited and did not hesitate to pursue and attack. But at this moment the first Hallmaster gave an order. Don't chase a cornered enemy. Turn back and continue to pursue that alien youth. In the minds of the Hallmasters, chasing and capturing Ji Tianxing was their primary goal. As for the three orc lords, if they were in the way they would get rid of them. If they were not in the way they could just ignore them. After receiving the order, the soldiers operating the warships turned around and flew east to catch up with the god-slaying warship. However, the fleet had deviated from their original route and was delayed for some time. The distance between them and the god-slaying warship had increased to 300,000 miles. What made the three Hallmasters even angrier was that Ji Tianxing had sensed that the opportunity had come. He actually put away the god-slaying warship and used the ultimate skill, so close, yet so far. The result was obvious. A white light flashed in the sky and Ji Tianxing's figure disappeared. In the next moment he crossed 140,000 miles and appeared in the distant sky. In this way, the distance between him and the Taiyu Shrine's fleet had increased to 440,000 miles. With the strength of the second Palace Master and the fifth Palace Master, even if they extended their divine consciousness to the furthest extent, they would not be able to sense his existence. Only the first Palace Master, who was the strongest among them, was able to use his divine sense to search for Ji Tianxing more than 400,000 miles away. Ji Tianxing used the so close, yet worlds apart technique to distance himself from the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. He had expected that none of the Palace Masters, including the second Palace Master, would be able to detect his location and tracks. At this time he should adjust his direction and change his escape route so that he could shake off the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. However, he thought of a problem, or rather a detail. Previously he was only 120,000 miles away from the three battleships of the Taiyu Shrine. At that time he had released his deity perception to investigate the three deity warships. He had seen the second Hallmaster's warship among them. Although the three divine warships belonged to the Taiyu Shrine and belonged to the various temple masters, they all had the insignia of the Taiyu Shrine. Apart from that, each divine warship had a different appearance and a unique insignia. As long as one observed carefully, they would be able to discover the differences between the divine warships and distinguish which warship belonged to which temple master. Other than the second Palace Master's warship, the other warships belonged to the fifth Palace Master or the sixth Palace Master. However, the warship in the lead was the most sacred and mighty. It was even more majestic and dignified than the second Palace Master's warship. Ji Tianxing couldn't help but wonder whose ship that battleship belonged to. Not only was it more powerful and faster than the second Palace Master's warship, but it was also ranked first in the fleet. There must be a problem. If the second Palace Master was the leader of this hunting mission, then his warship would definitely be ranked first. However, the second Palace Master's warship was ranked second. This meant that the owner of the first warship was more powerful and honorable than the second Palace Master. The answer was obvious. First Palace Master. It must be him. He actually took action personally. When he came to this conclusion, Ji Tianxing was extremely shocked. He had previously suspected that the first Palace Master might be in charge of this hunting mission. Otherwise, the Taiyu Shrine's fleet would not have been able to catch up with him after entering the unknown land. However, when he came to this conclusion, he still found it hard to believe. If the first Palace Master took action personally, then the Taiyu Shrine would have turned out in full force. Since they have made such a huge decision, they must have been determined to get me. This is definitely not to avenge Dao Xingyun, nor to protect the reputation of the Taiyu Shrine. It must be the first Palace Master who saw my outstanding talent and suspected that I was the one chosen by heaven. That's why he made such a big fuss. Now that things had developed to this point, even though Ji Tianxing had not seen the first Palace Master with his own eyes, he had guessed the answer through speculation and analysis. Since the first Palace Master was in that fleet, the pressure on him would be greater and he would be more cautious. A distance of 440,000 miles was a range that the other Palace Masters could not explore with their divine senses. However, the first palace master's strength was unfathomable. 440,000 miles might not be safe. Thus, Ji Tianxing flew in the sky with all his might, silently accumulating divine power in preparation for the next space diversion. In times of danger he would travel personally, and his speed would be faster than the god-slaying battleship. However, when the situation was safe he would still use the god-slaying battleship to travel. This was the same as all the other god-emperor experts. After all, traveling personally was very fast, but it would also consume more divine power and it would not last for long. Although using the god-slaying battleship to travel was slower, as long as he had sufficient cultivation resources, he could last for a long time. Unknowingly, another 15 minutes had passed. During this period of time, Ji Tianxing and the Taiyu Shrine's fleet had crossed thousands of mountains and rivers. The distance between the two sides was also shrinking, shortening to 380,000 miles. However, Ji Tianxing had also accumulated enough divine power, and his preparations were very sufficient. Swoosh! With a flash of white light he once again used the so close, yet so far technique and disappeared from the sky. In the next instant he had teleported 140,000 miles and appeared in the distant horizon. This way the distance between him and the fleet had increased to 520,000 miles. He was 100% sure of one thing. No matter how strong the first palace master was, his divine sense could not reach more than 500,000 miles. After all, 500,000 miles was a threshold, and it was also the limit that all God-Emperor experts could reach with their divine senses. Thus, Ji Tianxing decisively changed his direction and escape route. He was still flying east, and his goal was still to pass through the unknown land and reach the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. However, if he deviated more than 100,000 miles to the southeast, the Taiyu Shrine's fleet would completely lose track of him. Even if the palace masters realized that the situation was not good, they would use their divine senses and secret techniques to search for the divine power fluctuations and aura he left behind. He would also waste a lot of time. Chapter 47-42. Previously, when they were chasing after the deity-slaying warship, the second palace master had warned the first palace master that the foreign race youth was strong and had many tricks up his sleeve. However, the Lord Palace Master had never fought with Ji Tianxing before, and neither of them had met face to face. In the eyes of the Lord Hallmaster, even if the other party was the one chosen by heaven, he was only at the middle level of God Emperor. How strong could he be? The first Palace Master did not take it to heart, and the hunting operation was carried out step by step. That was until Ji Tianxing used the so close, yet worlds apart technique, which increased the distance between them to over 500,000 kilometers. When the first palace master's spiritual sense could not find any trace of Ji Tianxing, he knew that the situation was not good. Damn it! That kid is indeed somewhat strange. He's actually able to execute the spatial teleportation technique twice in a row within 15 minutes? After personally witnessing Ji Tianxing's methods, the first palace master understood why the second palace master gave him such a high evaluation. However, it was too late to discuss this matter now. The first palace master could only order the fleet to advance at full speed. At the same time he frowned and pondered, trying to figure out Ji Tianxing's escape route. Although that kid can perform spatial shifting twice in a quarter of an hour, he can't do it. However, that kind of divine ability would inflict severe backlash on himself, and he couldn't cast it multiple times in a row. In the end, he still had to rely on the divine warship to escape from the unknown land and enter the Pantheon of Immortality's sphere of influence. The first palace master stood in the cockpit of the flagship. He stared coldly at the sky before him, frowning as he pondered. That kid knows very well that if he uses a divine warship to travel, it will never be able to match our fleet's speed. If he had flown in a straight line, he would never have been able to shake us off. We would have caught up to him sooner or later. Therefore, after he used spatial diversion to distance himself from us, he will definitely change his escape route. What had happened in the past year proved that the Lord Hallmaster's wisdom and strategy were not inferior to Ji Tianxing's. It was precisely because of this that Ji Tianxing was in such a difficult situation. He had truly met his match. Shua! The three divine warships flew across the sky at lightning speed. In just a short while they had crossed over 500,000 miles. At this time the fleet stopped in the sky. Without waiting for the first palace master to give the order, the second palace master took the initiative to perform a divine power secret technique to search for the remaining divine power ripples and auras in the world. Previously, Ji Tianqing had escaped the pursuit of the Taiyu Shrine and quietly entered the unknown lands. But in the end, the Taiyu Shrine's fleet still caught up with him, and the biggest credit went to the second palace master. Now that the second palace master was using the same trick again, it could be said that he was very familiar with it. After a short period of 20 breaths, the second palace master found the result. In the sky in front of the fleet, there was a shallow trace that extended to tens of thousands of kilometers away like a thin mist and began to turn toward the southeast. That kid really changed his escape route and went southeast. After the second palace master reported the results, the fleet changed direction and headed southeast. Moments later, the fleet flew 400,000 kilometers to the southeast and stopped in the sky again. The second palace master used his divine ability and secret technique to search for the traces of divine power left behind by Ji Tianqing in the sky. After 20 breaths of searching, the second palace master found the divine power ripples and auras left behind by Ji Tianqing. However, the fleet flew over the head, and Ji Tianqing only flew 180,000 kilometers to the southeast before continuing to fly east. So the fleet turned back and followed the traces left by Ji Tianqing to the east. Logically speaking, the fleet only needed to fly in a straight line to the east and soon catch up with Ji Tianqing. But the first palace master was very cautious. He speculated that Ji Tianqing would not be so stupid and would definitely change direction a few more times in the escape route. Therefore, every hour the fleet traveled, he would ask the second palace master to use his divine ability and secret technique to search for the divine power ripples and auras left behind by Ji Tianqing. Although it would waste a lot of time, it was the safest way. At least they would not lose track of him. In the first 2 hours, the second palace master used his divine ability and secret technique twice to search for the traces left behind by Ji Tianqing. He was sure that Ji Tianqing did not change his route. However, when the second palace master used his divine ability and secret technique for the third time, he found that the traces of Ji Tianqing's divine power had disappeared. This proved that Ji Tianqing had changed his route. The fleet could only return the way they came. Every million kilometers, the second palace master would use his divine ability to search. After using his divine ability to search for too many times, the second palace master's divine power was exhausted and he could not hold on any longer. At this time, the first palace master could only use his own divine ability and secret technique to search for the traces left by Ji Tianqing. After 3 hours, the fleet finally found the divine power ripples and auras left by Ji Tianqing. So the fleet continued on their journey and followed the traces left by Ji Tianqing to the east. However, the fleet had been delayed for such a long time that Ji Tianqing had long left them in the dust. As time passed, the distance between the two parties increased. After half a day, even if the first palace master and the second palace master used their divine ability and secret technique again, it was difficult to find the traces left by Ji Tianqing. After all, the divine power ripples and auras he left behind were very weak and would fade and disappear in 2 to 4 hours. Since they could not find any trace of Ji Tianqing, the two palace masters were somewhat frustrated and could only give up on the search. The first palace master decisively ordered the fleet to advance at full speed to the east. Anyway, they knew very well that Ji Tianqing's ultimate goal was to pass through the unknown land and enter the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. It was fine even if they lost track of him temporarily. As long as they crossed the unknown land at the fastest speed, they could continue to search for Ji Tianqing in the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. At the same time, the god-slaying battleship was traveling through the unknown land, flying through the vast sea of clouds at lightning speed. In the cockpit of the battleship, Bai Long, who was in charge of steering the battleship, stared straight ahead and asked his master behind him, "Master, didn't we shake off the Taiyu Shrine's fleet a long time ago? Why do we have to change our route several times in the process of moving forward?" Ji Tianqing sat cross-legged on the ground with his eyes closed. He was meditating and adjusting his breathing. Hearing this, he calmly explained, "Previously, I didn't know that the first palace master was also personally involved in the pursuit, so I wasn't too cautious. In the end, we managed to shake off the Taiyu Shrine's pursuit, but we were still caught by the Taiyu Shrine's fleet in the unknown land. The first palace master is an ancient god clan from the god realm. He is extremely powerful and has outstanding strategies. He cannot be underestimated. Previously we were still considered lucky. The two god emperors from the Beast clan helped us win a sliver of an opportunity and successfully escaped. If we don't be more careful, the next time the Taiyu Shrine's fleet catches up to us, we will be dead for sure. After listening to his master's explanation, Bai Long finally understood the reason and could not help but sigh. The first hall master of the Great Cosmos Shrine is a match for master. They are evenly matched. Chapter 47-43. After a series of confrontations, Ji Tianxing and White Dragon both realized that the Grand Hall Master of the Taiyu Shrine was very difficult to deal with. In fact, his strength and intelligence were top-notch among the 4 sacred halls. During the process of the two sides fighting and chasing, Ji Tianxing was constantly speculating about the Taiyu Shrine's movements, and the Grand Hall Master was also predicting his choices. Even now, he had changed his route several times in the process of escaping, so he should have shaken off the Taiyu Shrine's fleet and was very safe. However, he still couldn't let his guard down. He was still analyzing and speculating about the Grand Hallmaster's next move. Now that we've shaken off the Taiyu Shrine's fleet with the Grand Hallmaster's wisdom, he must have guessed that my target is the Pantheon of Immortality. Therefore it's very likely that they'll go all the way east and pass through the unknown land at the fastest speed, entering the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. When they get there, they'll probably wait at the edge of the unknown land. Otherwise, they'll secretly investigate my whereabouts in the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. These thoughts flashed through Ji Tianxing's mind as he silently analyzed. He deduced several follow-up scenarios, weighed the pros and cons and made a decision. White Dragon, change the direction and head south. Suddenly receiving his master's order, White Dragon subconsciously replied, yes. He controlled the array and made the Godslayer battleship fly south. Then he asked, Master, why change the direction? Aren't we going to the Pantheon of Immortality? Ji Tianxing shook his head and explained, of course we're going, but not now. The 6 hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine will come out in full force, even if they have to rush into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality to catch us. Before Dao Xingyun died, he sent a warning to Lu Jiang and Yu Ming. If those 2 guys aren't stupid, they'll definitely join forces with the Pantheon of Immortality to find a way to deal with me. Therefore, now that we have entered the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, we are walking right into a trap. We are surrounded by enemies. Bai Long immediately understood his master's meaning and continued, so we'll turn south and not show ourselves for the time being. When the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine entered the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, they would definitely not form an alliance or cooperate with each other. It was very likely that a conflict would break out. When both sides are injured, we will go to the Pantheon of Immortality. Only then will we have a chance to turn the tables. Am I right, Shizhuan? Ji Tianxing nodded slightly. That's right. Anyway, we've already killed Azura and Dao Xingyun. Only Lu Jiang and Netherworld are left. Even if you want to take revenge, you don't have to be in a hurry. You can wait a few more years. White Dragon nodded to show that he understood and then asked, Master, where are we going? Are we hiding in the south of the unknown lands, or are we going through the unknown lands? Ji Tianxing thought for a moment and said, let's fly south first. When the time comes, we'll decide based on the situation. The White Dragon replied and focused on controlling the god-slaying battleship. Ji Tianxing also entered the Jutian 10 Absolutes Tower and returned to the distorted spacetime to cultivate in seclusion. In order to shake off the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine, he had used up a lot of his divine power. In addition, his previous injuries had not healed and his strength had not recovered. He still needed a long time to recuperate. The unknown lands, which had been peaceful for a long time, became lively and noisy. Following the orders of the 3 lords, countless elite beast race god kings were gathering in large numbers. More and more beast race experts received the news that the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine had launched a large-scale attack. Underworld and Golden Horse Lord were injured by the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine, and Heaven Lord did not gain any benefits. The 3 lords gathered together and were filled with anger. They cursed the Taiyu Shrine countless times. For the time being, they did not know the relationship between the 4 battleships of the Taiyu Shrine. However, after they calmed down, they noticed all kinds of clues. They guessed that the 3 divine battleships of the Taiyu Shrine and the unfamiliar battleship were not on the same side. Otherwise, after the 3 divine battleships injured Underworld and Golden Horse Lord, they would definitely chase after them and kill them completely. Although the three beast race lords realized that they had missed some opportunities, they did not regret it. They also did not care what the four divine battleships wanted to do. They only knew that the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine entering the unknown lands was not a good thing. They had to gather a large number of troops to intercept and besiege them. Not long after, another leader of the beast race reported to them another piece of news. It was said that another 3 battleships of the Taiyu Shrine had entered the unknown lands and were flying east. The 3 beast race lords were shocked. Their hearts were filled with shock and worry. The Taiyu Shrine had sent out 6 battleships to form 2 fleets and entered the unknown lands one after the other. What did this mean? The 6 temple lords of the Taiyu Shrine had come out in full force? With such a powerful force invading, were they trying to completely conquer the unknown lands? The 3 lords became more and more anxious. They quickly gathered the elite divine kings and rushed to intercept the other 3 battleships. At the same time, the battleships of the First Temple Lord, Second Temple Lord and Fifth Temple Lord were still shuttling through the unknown lands and flying east firmly and quickly. The first step of their plan was to set up an ambush at the border of the unknown lands and intercept Ji Tianxing's god-slaying battleship. If they really missed it or could not intercept it, they would sneak into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and slowly investigate and find out. No one knew that the god-slaying battleship had changed its route and was heading south of the unknown lands. Time passed by quietly. Day after day passed. Soon 10 days had passed. The 3 battleships led by the First Temple Lord successfully passed through the unknown lands and arrived at the border of the unknown lands. There was an endless stretch of towering mountains and an endless grassland at the border. The towering mountain range with lush forests was the unknown lands. Once they entered the endless grassland, they would enter the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. The battleships of the First Temple Lord, Second Temple Lord and Fifth Temple Lord spread out along the border and formed a line of defense that was 1,000,000 miles long. They led the elite divine kings under their command to set up arrays, traps and ambushes on this line of defense. As long as Ji Tianxing's god-slaying battleship passed by here, it would not be able to escape their detection and would immediately be ambushed and surrounded. On the other side, the battleships of the Third Temple Lord, Fourth Temple Lord and Sixth Temple Lord also formed a fleet and were still shuttling through the unknown lands. They had already traveled more than half the distance. In another day, they would be able to charge out of the unknown lands and meet up with the First Temple Lord's fleet. But what they did not expect was that the 3 beast lords led tens of thousands of elite beast clan soldiers from different directions and blocked their path. After the 3 god-slaying battleships were surrounded, the 2 sides did not waste any time and immediately started fighting and killing. The 3 temple lords had the advantage with their emperor-level god-slaying battleships and their attacks were very fierce. But the 3 beast lords led tens of thousands of beast clan god-slaying battleships. They had the advantage of numbers and geography. The 2 sides fought for several hours. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but they were evenly matched. Chapter 47-44. Qiankuan, Nether Wilderness and Golden Horse territorial lords could not defeat the First Hallmaster, Second Hallmaster and Fifth Hallmaster. However, it was not a problem for them to deal with the Third Hallmaster, Fourth Hallmaster and Sixth Hallmaster. After all, both sides were at the same level. Furthermore, the 3 lords and tens of thousands of beast race elites had set up an encirclement and ambushed the 3 battleships. The 2 sides fought for 12 hours and traversed more than 3,000,000 miles of the battlefield. Everywhere they passed, everything was turned into ruins. At least 4,000 beast race godly kings were killed. Not even their corpses were left. Even the 3 beast race lords were injured to varying degrees. Their combat strength had decreased. However, the situation of the 3 battleships was not optimistic either. Not only were the 3 battleships damaged, but there were many dents and cracks on their surfaces. Even the interior of the battleships was damaged to varying degrees. The 3 Hallmasters led 3,000 elite godly kings, but more than 1,000 of them had died in this battle. Most of the remaining 1,000 elite godly kings were injured, and their combat strength had decreased. If the battle continued, the 3 lords would be able to gather even more beast race elites, and they would be able to continuously come to their aid. The First Hallmaster, Second Hallmaster and Fifth Hallmaster were far away at the border of the unknown lands. Even if they came to help, they would need at least a day. In the end, the 3 hall masters and the surviving 1,000 elite godly kings would be drowned by the endless beast race army until all of them died in battle. Therefore, halfway through the battle, the 3 hall masters gave the order to stop fighting the beast race army and break out of the encirclement with all their might. The second half of the battle was basically the 3 divine battleships fleeing while thousands of beast race elites chased after them. In the end, the 3 battleships paid a terrible price to break out of the encirclement and successfully escaped. The 3 hall masters did not escape west and return to the Taiyu Shrine's territory. Instead, they continued east to meet up with the first hall masters' fleet. After the battle ended, the 3 beast race lords left behind a portion of the beast race elites to clean up the battlefield. As they circulated their energy to heal themselves, they led the several thousand beast race god kings eastward in pursuit. They wanted to take advantage of the victory and destroy one of the 2 fleets of the Taiyu Shrine before they met up. This way, it would be much easier for them to deal with the first Hallmaster's fleet. The god-slaying battleship flew south for 10 days. It had already passed through the Golden Horse feudal lord's sphere of influence, but it still hadn't left the unknown land. This surprised the White Dragon. He thought to himself, why is this unknown land so vast? Could it be that there are other beast overlords besides the 3 beast overlords? Although he had seen the map of the Star of Origin before and understood the terrain of the entire continent, he was not familiar with it. However, that was only a rough estimate and not detailed enough. This was especially true for the mysterious and unknown lands that were sandwiched between the 4 shrines. No map could describe them clearly. White Dragon thought that after leaving the Golden Horse Lord's territory, he would be able to leave the unknown land. But he didn't expect that south of the Golden Horse Lord's territory was still a vast primitive jungle and mountain range. He couldn't help but wonder who was the ruler of this unknown land. In addition, if they continued to fly south and cross this strange and unknown land, where would they arrive? Every star was either round or oval. If one were to advance in a straight line, they would eventually circle around the star and return to their starting point. White Dragon understood this basic knowledge in his previous life without Master's teaching. He had seen it on the map before. The territories of the 4 shrines and many unknown lands were connected to form a circle. And the blank area in the middle of the circle was the mysterious Chaos Sea. The Chaos Sea was north of the shrines, and the map didn't indicate what was south of the 4 shrines. White Dragon couldn't make up his mind, so he could only send a message to Ji Tianxing for instructions. Next, should they stay in this unknown land and recuperate or continue to explore the south? 10 days had passed in the outside world. Ji Tianxing had been cultivating in seclusion for more than a year in the distorted spacetime of the God Pagoda. His injuries had recovered by 90%, and his strength had also recovered by 70 to 80%. There were no major problems. After another 2 or 3 years of seclusion, he would be able to recover to his peak state. Hearing White Dragon's message, Ji Tianxing ended his cultivation, left the distorted spacetime, and appeared in the battleship's cockpit. Master, we flew south for 10 days. White Dragon bowed to Ji Tianxing. After greeting him, he began to explain the situation. Ji Tianxing nodded slightly to show that he understood. He said, actually, I had already guessed that this would be the case, so I asked you to change your route 10 days ago and fly south. White Dragon was a little stunned. He asked, Master, do you know what's going on in this area? Ji Tianxing nodded and a meaningful smile appeared on his face. He said, in the past the Prajna God Emperor told me that the god of the underworld and the pantheon of immortality had come into contact, and Lu Zhiyang was unwilling to submit to others, so he established his own force in an unknown land and established his own sect. Now that things have come to this, the god of the underworld and the pantheon of immortality might have joined forces a long time ago. Only Lu Zhiyang wouldn't cooperate with any shrines and focus on developing his own force. And this area is very likely the territory he chose. Both master and disciple understood that the reason Lu Zhiyang didn't cooperate with any shrines wasn't because he was arrogant. In terms of arrogance, the god of the underworld was the most confident and arrogant one. The main reason was that the other 4 god emperors had all come into contact with shrines. No matter which shrine Lu Zhiyang came into contact with, he would be a latecomer and wouldn't be valued. Moreover, if 2 god emperors joined a shrine at the same time, it would definitely deepen the conflict between them. Rather than that, Lu Zhiyang might as well establish his own sect. Master, is this really Lu Zhiyang's territory? White Dragon only found it unbelievable. He asked excitedly, "If that's the case, then we don't have to rush to the Pantheon of Immortality. We can find Lu Jiang first, kill him and then leave." Ji Tianxing smiled and nodded. He said, "That's right. That's exactly what I'm planning. It won't delay time and won't affect our revenge." White Dragon hurriedly said, "Master, then this disciple will do his best to find Lu Jiang's location." Ji Tianxing nodded in agreement. Of course, the preliminary investigation would be left to White Dragon to complete. But in the end he still had to find Lu Jiang and take revenge on him himself. The god-slaying battleship continued to fly south. However, they activated the array to conceal their tracks and auras, so as not to alarm the beasts in the forest. Half a day later, when the god-slaying battleship passed by a majestic mountain range, they discovered a cluster of houses and courtyards by the banks of a large river. Hundreds of houses and courtyards were scattered in the forest at an angle to the south of the mountain range, forming a tribe of beasts. Chapter 47-45. Even though the houses and buildings of the beast race tribe looked simple and crude, it was obvious that the style of the houses was influenced by the style of the god realm. In the territories of the Dark Wilderness, Qian Kuan and Golden Horse Lords, the beast race would also build houses and lairs, but it was obviously in the beast race's style. Ji Tianxing and the White Dragon noticed these subtle differences, and they had a plan in their hearts. Swoosh! The god-slaying battleship stopped high in the clouds while Ji Tianxing waited in the cockpit. Bai Long left the battleship and concealed his whereabouts and divine power ripples. He quietly approached the beast race tribe to gather information. Ji Tianxing had already used his divine sense to scan the tribe and found that there were only about 3,000 people in the tribe. Among them there were a small number of god kings, but there were no god emperors. Most of the beast race members were god lords, and there were even some god realm living beings. A high-level god king like Bai Long would not be discovered by the beast race in the tribe, so his safety would not be a problem. However, Bai Long did not want to make any mistakes and affect his master's revenge plan, so he was extra careful. He carefully snuck into the tribe and hid in the dark to observe the beast race members and eavesdrop on their conversations. He also investigated many houses and mansions, and even flipped through the beast skin scrolls used by the beast race to record words and various divine weapons. 8 hours later, Bai Long finished his investigation and secretly understood the situation of the tribe. He then quietly left and returned to the god-slaying battleship. From beginning to end he was not discovered by the beast race members, including the tribe chief who was a level 6 god king. Swoosh! There was a flash of white light and Bai Long returned to the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship and appeared in front of Ji Tianxing. He first bowed and greeted him, then began to report the situation. "Master, your disciple has already investigated the beastmen tribe below. There are more than 2,400 people in the tribe. 80% of them are beast race members and 20% are foreign races. I'm not sure which races there are, but I can see that there are at least 7 to 8 races. There were more than 60 God King realm experts in the village, but none of them were upper god kings. The 2 strongest ones were only middle god kings. However, most of them were still using the beast clan's language and writing, and their living habits were also fixed. But judging from some details, they were still influenced by the Protoss. Most importantly, this disciple heard the word, Divine Master, mentioned in the beast skin scrolls and the conversation between the 2 beast race god kings. Bai Long told Ji Tianxing all the information and clues he had found in his investigation. After Ji Tianxing heard this, he raised his eyebrows and asked, "Did you find out who the Divine Master is?" Bai Long shook his head and explained, "In order not to alert them, I did not meet with those god kings, nor did I capture them or use soul-searching techniques on them. However, judging from their attitude and tone, the so-called Divine Master should be a person with an extremely high status and was relatively sacred. Based on my intuition, it should be the same as the temple masters of the 4 great temples." Ji Tianxing nodded slightly and asked, "Then did you find any other useful information?" White Dragon looked ashamed and shook his head. Ji Tianxing did not say anything else. He let White Dragon steer the battleship and continue flying south. It's right not to alert them. It would be difficult for the beast race members of such a small tribe to know the core information. Let's continue flying south and wait until we encounter a city or a large tribe. White Dragon acknowledged and steered the god-slaying battleship away quietly. In the next half a day, the god-slaying battleship discovered many large and small tribes. These tribes had at most tens of thousands of people and at least a few thousand people. They were scattered in the vast primitive forest. Just like the small tribe they first discovered, each tribe had the most beast race members. There were also some foreign races mixed in. They all knew how to build houses and courtyards. They also built majestic palaces. All kinds of houses and buildings inherited the rough style of the beast race. However, there were also some traces of the god realm's buildings. Compared to the beast race members scattered in the forest and lived in their nests, these beast race members were considered to have been educated. Finally, the god-slaying battleship encountered a city. It was a majestic city that stood at the peak of a mountain. It had a radius of several dozen kilometers. The main body of the city was built with all kinds of giant stones. It looked very tough and solemn. Not only did this city have 2 city gates, but it also had a huge defensive divine formation. There were also more than 2,000 guards patrolling and defending the city walls. Ji Tianxing had reason to believe that a city of this scale would definitely be an important city in this unknown land. The expert who controlled this city would definitely know more secret information. Thus, Ji Tianxing put away the god-slaying battleship, concealed his tracks and aura and quietly snuck into the city. No one could discover his presence even if he walked slowly in the city, walked through the streets and small alleys, and brushed shoulders with countless beast race members. He quietly observed and eavesdropped on the conversations of countless beast race members. He also quietly spread out his divine sense and enveloped the entire city. After a while he found out that there were over 400,000 people living in this city. 80% of them were beast race members, and there were also many other races living beings. Among the 400,000 people, half of them had the power of God Monarch realm. There were also over 10,000 God King experts. However, in the entire city, the strongest ones were only the 2 9th degree realm upper-level God Kings. There wasn't even a peak God King, let alone an Emperor God expert. After discovering the residence of the city lord, Ji Tianxing quietly approached and snuck in without making a sound. He didn't alert anyone and didn't attack the city lord. He only secretly flipped through various books and beast skin scrolls to eavesdrop on the city lord's movements. After a few hours he found the clues that he wanted. From the city lord's mouth he heard the 2 words Divine Master, and understood that the Divine Master was the city lord who ruled this unknown land. More than 10 years ago this unknown land was scattered and disorderly. It was also a land without an owner. Many beast race leaders ruled by themselves. But ever since the Divine Master came to this area, he used his invincible power and powerful methods to quickly subdue many beast race leaders. Later on, the Divine Master built a divine palace at the Phoenix Ridge in the south and announced that he would occupy and rule this area. Countless beast race tribes and towns either submitted to the Divine Master or were conquered or destroyed. Luckily, the Divine Master had always been benevolent. He ruled this unknown land mainly by subduing. Not only did the Divine Master want to rule the beast race, he also accepted many other races' living beings. As long as they were loyal to the Divine Master and had the ability and means, they would be placed in important positions by the Divine Master. The Divine Master would never favor or discriminate against any race. Chapter 47-46. Half a day later, Ji Tianxing left the city. He had already found the information he wanted in the city. He came to this area more than a decade ago, had invincible strength and powerful means, quickly unified this unknown land, and was respectfully called the Divine Master. The direction of this information was very clear. No one could say the name of the Divine Master or what race he was or what he looked like. But there were traces of the deities both inside and outside the city, whether it was the architectural style, lifestyle, system or rules. Ji Tianxing was 90% sure that he could confirm the identity of the Divine Master. So after he left the city he let by long drive the deity-slaying battleship all the way south. Phoenix Ridge and the Divine Palace were his targets. Although he still did not know where Phoenix Ridge was and where the Divine Palace was built. But he believed that as long as he continued south he would definitely find some clues. 2 days had passed. The deity-slaying battleship was still rushing south at full speed. At the same time, the 3rd, 4th and 6th Palace Masters finally rushed out of the unknown land and met up with the 1st Palace Master and the others at the border. The 6 palace masters of the Taiyu Shrine gathered together and formed a line of defense at the border. From south to north it stretched for nearly 2 million miles. They set up all kinds of traps and ambushes as well as many divine formations. It was an inescapable net. As long as Ji Tianxing rushed out of the unknown land, there was a 95% chance that he would run into this line of defense. At that time, the palace masters and thousands of elite divine kings would make it impossible for Ji Tianxing to escape. After setting up the traps and ambushes, the palace masters waited patiently. The 3rd, 4th, and 6th palace masters were injured, so they took the opportunity to recuperate. However, the 6 palace masters waited at the border for an entire day, but they did not see Ji Tianxing appear. The palace masters were a little impatient and were no longer confident. They were all muttering in their hearts. Even if the alien youth was injured and his strength had decreased greatly, he should not be so slow. It had been an entire day. No matter what, the alien youth should have appeared. Why had he not appeared yet? Could it be that the alien youth was hiding in the unknown land and refused to come out? Wasn't he going to cross the unknown land and head to the Pantheon of Immortality? Filled with doubts, the Hall Masters sent messages to seek the first Hall Master's opinion. The first Palace Master was also puzzled. He could not understand what was going on. Logically speaking, that kid's speed can't be faster than ours. We must have reached the border before him. But he still hadn't appeared, so there were only 2 possibilities. Either he changed his direction and route, bypassing our defense line and leaving the unknown lands long ago. Otherwise, it could be that he's not in a hurry to leave the unknown lands and is hiding somewhere to recover his strength. No matter how smart the Grand Palace Master was, he would never have guessed the truth. He would never have thought that Ji Tianxing would fly south. The first Palace Master also had a headache when faced with the questioning of the Palace Masters. He analyzed 2 outcomes, but no matter which one it was very difficult to deal with. Therefore, he could only order the Palace Masters to hold on for another 3 days. If Ji Tianxing still did not show up after 3 days, they would withdraw their defensive line and sneak into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. They could only plan their future actions at length. Not long after he gave the order, there was a new situation. The 3rd Palace Master sent a message to report a piece of news to him. Just a while ago, the 3 Beast Clan lords led tens of thousands of elite Beast Clan soldiers and charged out of the unknown lands. Previously, the 3 Palace Masters had fought with the 3 Beast Clan lords in the unknown lands. Now that the 2 sides met again, there was no need for nonsense. They immediately started fighting. The 3 Beast Clan lords came with hatred. They brought tens of thousands of elite Beast Clan lords to seek revenge. They were aggressive and had extremely powerful combat abilities. Even though the 3rd Palace Master had set up traps and ambushes in advance and had the help of a few divine formations, they could not stop the attack of the Beast Clan army. In a short battle, the 3rd Palace Master's soldiers suffered heavy casualties. The defense line was about to be breached. When he heard this news, the 1st Palace Master was furious. He was so angry that his face turned green. Damn the Beast Clan, they are so stupid. They deserve to die for ruining my plans at such a crucial time. The Taiyu Shrine came out in full force just to capture the foreign race youth who might be the chosen one. The 3 leaders of the beast race were just bystanders. This matter had nothing to do with them, but they wanted to interfere. Not only did they want to be Ji Tianxing's enemy, they also wanted to oppose the Taiyu Temple. The first Hall Master finally understood that the 3 beast race overlords were fools. Even now, they still hadn't figured out the relationship between the Cosmos Temple and that alien youth. The 3 Beast Clan lords probably thought that they were on the same side. The Taiyu Shrine was very frustrated. However, they could not explain anything. This was too frustrating. Go and reinforce them. I will be there soon. The 1st Palace Master did not hesitate to give the order. He asked the 2nd Palace Master, 4th Palace Master, and 5th Palace Master nearby to reinforce them. He also led more than 300 elite Beast Clan lords to reinforce them on divine ships. This time he was really angry. He swore to gather all his forces and kill the 3 Beast Clan lords first to prevent them from getting in the way. 1,300,000 miles away at the border of the unknown lands. To the west was a majestic mountain range and a lush forest. To the east was a boundless grassland. At this moment, an intense battle was in progress. The 3 Beast Clan lords had all revealed their true forms. They had turned into 3 giant beasts the size of mountains. They were high in the sky, releasing divine technique flames that covered the sky. More than 10,000 ferocious-looking beast clan lords were in formation in the sky. They released divine technique attacks that rained down like a torrential flood. In the sky above the grassland, a 1,000-foot-long divine ship lit up with a dazzling divine light. It constantly released divine light beams. There were also more than 400 elite beast clan lords lined up on both sides of the divine ship. Under the cover of the divine ship, they neutralized the attacks of the beast clan army. The difference in numbers between the two sides was too great. The soldiers under the third palace master could not withstand the attacks of the beast clan army. They were beaten into a disorderly state and suffered heavy casualties. In just a few breaths of time, more than 200 elite beast clan lords had been killed by the beast clan army. As time passed, elite beast clan lords were killed at any time. Not even their corpses were left. The divine ship could only protect the surviving soldiers as they fought and retreated. They tried their best to stall for time. Fortunately, the fifth palace master, who was closest to the third palace master, brought more than 600 elite beast clan lords and rushed over in time to reinforce the third palace master. With the fifth palace master and his divine ship, the pressure on the third palace master was greatly reduced. Originally, he had been surrounded by the three beast clan lords and was severely injured. He was ready to escape at any moment. Since the fifth palace master had come to reinforce him, it meant that the other palace masters would arrive soon. The third palace master felt more at ease. He joined forces with the fifth palace master to deal with the three beast clan lords. They gradually stabilized their footing. Chapter 47-47. Even though the third hallmaster and fifth hallmaster were fighting side by side, they were still at a disadvantage. The two warships and hundreds of elite godly kings were still being beaten back. However, they retreated in an orderly manner and were not in a mess. The soldiers did not lose their morale either. After another 100 breaths, another 100 elite godly kings were killed. The two warships also suffered varying degrees of damage. At this moment, the fourth hallmaster rushed over from afar with a few hundred elite godly kings on his divine warship. He joined the battle without a word. The three hallmasters joined forces and finally managed to fend off the attacks of the three beast tribe lords. However, the three warships and over 1,000 elite godly kings were still unable to fend off the attacks of the beast tribe army. Hundreds of thousands of divine skill lights clashed violently in the sky, creating a deafening sound that spread for tens of thousands of miles. Violent shockwaves wrapped around billions of godly light fragments and spread outwards like multicolored ripples, circle after circle. Within tens of thousands of miles, the majestic mountains and dense forests, as well as the vast grassland, were all reduced to ruins, leaving behind patches of black scorched earth. The battle was extremely tragic. However, the beast tribe army became more and more excited as they fought. Their blood boiled as their killing intent soared. Even though the three hallmasters joined forces, they could not fend off the attacks of the beast tribe army. The soldiers continued to be injured and the three warships continued to retreat towards the grassland. Not long after, the second hallmaster arrived on his divine warship with over 1,000 elite godly kings. When the second hallmaster joined the battle and joined forces with the other three hallmasters to attack the three beast tribe lords, the situation on the battlefield changed. The second hallmaster was too powerful. Even Ji Tianxing was no match for him, let alone the three middle god emperor realm beast tribe lords. As a result, the situation was reversed. The three beast tribe lords were beaten back and began to retreat into the unknown. The four warships and over 2,000 elite godly kings joined forces to fend off the attacks of the beast tribe army. They gradually reached a balance. The beast tribe army could no longer advance. The soldiers of the Taiyu Shrine also stabilized their positions and began to counterattack. The situation was not good for the beast tribe army. The murderous elite godly kings began to suffer heavy casualties. Now that things had developed to this point, the three lords of Qianquan, Underworld and Golden Horse had to consider the consequences. They had long known that the Taiyu Shrine had turned out in full force. They had sent out 6 warships, which meant that all 6 temple masters had come. Now that 3 hall masters had come as reinforcements, there would definitely be 2 more hall masters coming to help. If they did not retreat in time, they would not be able to retreat even if they wanted to when the other 2 hall masters came to reinforce them. Therefore Yu Huang, Qian Kun and Golden Horse Lord discussed for a while and decisively ordered the Beast Clan army to retreat. Boom boom boom. Seeing that the Beast Race army was retreating to an unknown location, the Taiyu Shrine soldiers' confidence was greatly boosted. Their morale was high and they launched a counterattack in pursuit. With no other choice, the three orc lords could only divert their attention to cover for him. Even though the distance between the two sides was more than 100,000 li, both sides had suffered a large number of casualties. But in the end, the three overlords paid a heavy price and retreated with their armies. The four hall masters wanted to take advantage of the victory to pursue and attack, but they saw that more than half of their soldiers had died. The four warships were also riddled with holes and needed to be repaired. Most importantly, their goal was to capture the alien youth, not to kill the orc lords. There was no need to sacrifice the lives of their soldiers in this matter. Therefore, the second hall master decisively ordered everyone to stop pursuing. The battle was over. Only scorched earth and ruins with a radius of more than 100,000 li were left. The ground was littered with broken weapons, armor and corpses as well as billowing smoke and dust. The second hall master ordered some of the soldiers to stay and clean up the battlefield. The rest returned to their respective areas and continued to preside over the defense line. At this moment, the first hall master's warship arrived. Seeing the situation on the battlefield, the first hall master did not need to ask to know the outcome. Although he was still angry and wanted to ask the second hall master why he did not pursue into the unknown and kill the three orc lords, the first hall master's men were all killed. However, he saw that half of the soldiers under the command of the four palace masters had already died. The soldiers who were lucky enough to survive were also injured. Therefore, the first hall master dispelled that thought. He sent a telepathic message to the other hall masters and left on his warship. The three lords of Qian Kun, Underworld and Golden Horse led the remaining 6,000 orc elites and fled 1,000,000 li away, hiding in the unknown. They had thought that the other party would pursue and kill them, but they did not expect the other party to stay at the border of the unknown. While the three lords heaved a sigh of relief, they also felt that the situation was a little strange. Therefore, they ordered the orc elites under their command to stay where they were and quickly treat their injuries and recover their divine power. At the same time, they gathered together to discuss the Taiyu Shrine's purpose. Previously, we thought that the Taiyu Shrine had turned out in full force to kill us and take over our territory. But now it seems that this is not the case. They turned out in full force, crossed the unknown and set up traps and ambushes at the border. What are they trying to do? Could it be that the Taiyu Shrine wants to declare war on the Pantheon of Immortality? After all, past that border is the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. That can't be. The shrines have been at peace for tens of thousands of years. There are no direct conflicts of interest or territorial disputes between the two sides. Why would they suddenly declare war? I have a bold guess. You can see if it makes sense. Do you still remember the divine worship from before? The one we were chasing. I suspect that the divine worship has nothing to do with the Taiyu Shrine. Even the 6 lords of the Taiyu Shrine came to hunt down that divine worship. That's impossible, right? That divine worship looks ordinary and there's nothing special about it. How could it make the Taiyu Shrine turn out in full force? Regardless of whether you believe it or not, I think it makes sense. Otherwise, the 6 lords of the Taiyu Shrine would not set up traps and ambushes at the border. Yes. If the Taiyu Shrine wanted to deal with us, they had several opportunities to do so. For example, just now, they only needed to chase with all their might to make it impossible for us to escape. There's only one explanation. Their target is not us, nor is it the Pantheon of Immortality. It's that mysterious worship. Since the Taiyu Shrine is chasing after that divine worship at all costs, they must have their reasons. If we can find that worship, we can solve this mystery. Where did that worship escape to? It should have left the unknown long ago, right? The 3 lords discussed in secret for a while, but they did not come up with any useful plans. Thus, they temporarily stopped arguing about this matter and reached a consensus after some discussion. That was, to hide at the border and heal, gather more beasts, and secretly monitor the 6 temple masters of the Cosmos Temple to see what would happen. Chapter 47-48. The border area of the unknown land was in a stalemate. The 3 orc lords and thousands of orc soldiers were recuperating while monitoring the movements of the Taiyu Shrine. The 6 temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine were still in a defensive line at the border area, waiting for an opportunity. However, after waiting for another day, they still did not see Ji Tianxing appear. Therefore, the 6 temple masters prepared to withdraw their defensive line and leave the border area. Next, they would enter the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality to search for Ji Tianxing. However, at this moment something unexpected happened. A majestic fleet surrounded by divine light flew out from the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and headed straight for the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine. There were 5 godly warships in the fleet that covered the sky. They were ferocious and filled with murderous intent. In a short while, the fleet flew to the end of the horizon and stopped 10,000 miles away from the Taiyu Shrine fleet. The 3rd temple master, the 4th temple master, and the 6th temple master had just gathered. They looked at the fleet 10,000 miles away and frowned. Why would there be a fleet at this time? That fleet came from the Pantheon of Immortality. It should be them. I saw it. There are 4 godly warships with the insignia of the Pantheon of Immortality on them. It's them. Damn it. We were just about to sneak into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality when they arrived at this time. Report this to the 1st temple master and ask him to make a decision. The Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality were the closest to each other. There was only an unknown land between the 2 godly warships. In the past tens of thousands of years, the temple masters of the 2 temples had interacted many times. They were not strangers to each other. The 3 temple masters could not only recognize that fleet as the flagship of the Pantheon of Immortality, but they could also tell which temple masters were on it. They were very alert and ordered the warships to assume a defensive posture. All the soldiers were also prepared for battle. At the same time, the 3rd palace master quickly sent a message to the 1st palace master to report the news. On the other side, in the fleet of the Pantheon of Immortality, the temple masters on the 5 divine warships were also frowning with complicated expressions. I've long guessed that the Taiyu Shrine would send a few shrine masters here to hunt down that Kenshin. I didn't expect to run into them here. We're still a little late. Judging from their posture, they've already set up an ambush at the border. They set up a defensive line at the border. Are they waiting for the Kenshin to walk right into their trap? Does that mean Kenshin is still in the unknown lands? That's very likely. Quickly report this news to the 1st hall master. Let's ask the 6th palace master and see what he has to say. He was the one who provided the information, and the 1st palace master made the plan after analyzing and speculating. Of the 5 divine warships, 4 of them had the insignia of the Pantheon of Immortality. There was no doubt that the owners of these 4 warships were the temple masters of the Pantheon of Immortality, from the 2nd palace master to the 5th palace master. The black warship without the insignia of the Pantheon of Immortality exuded a gloomy chill. It was the warship of the new 6th palace master. This 6th palace master was a member of the Flood tribe. His background were unknown, and his nickname was Nether. He had come to the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality more than a decade ago and had met the Pantheon of Immortality many times. He had even fought with 2 temple masters. In the past few years, the temple masters of the Pantheon of Immortality had all thought that the god of the underworld might be the one chosen by heaven that they were looking for. Therefore, the Pantheon of Immortality had repeatedly asked the god of the underworld to join the temple and be conferred the title of 6th palace master. But the god of the underworld's attitude had always been vague, as if he was waiting for the best offer. After many negotiations, the 2 sides had not reached a consensus. But just a few months ago, the god of the underworld had received some news or been provoked by something, and he had taken the initiative to meet with the 1st palace master and had a secret conversation with him for an entire night. Later, the temple masters found out that the god of the underworld had come from the realm of gods, and that there were 4 god emperor powerhouses who had come to the planet of origin with him. However, the 4 god emperor powerhouses were scattered in different areas and had met with the other temples. The god of the underworld had openly admitted that he was not the one chosen by heaven, but a talented god emperor who had only cultivated for a short period of time. Among the 4 god emperor from the realm of gods, there was a god emperor called Kenshin who had a grudge against them. In the past 10 years, Kenshin had used various schemes to kill 3 of the god of the underworld's companions. Now, Kenshin had just caused havoc in the Taiyu Shrine, and would definitely pass through the unknown lands and enter the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. Kenshin's next step was to mess with the pantheon of immortality and find an opportunity to assassinate him. The god of the underworld had received the news in advance, and decided to cooperate with the pantheon of immortality to deal with Kenshin. When they first heard this news, the pantheon of immortality's temple masters had mixed feelings. In their opinion, since the god of the underworld was not the one chosen by heaven, then they did not have to accept the god of the underworld, and there was no need to promise him the position of sixth temple master. On the other hand, the foreign god emperor called Kenshin was brave and resourceful, and his performance was astonishing. If possible, the pantheon of immortality could absorb him and increase their power. It was so much so that the second palace master and the third palace master had even analyzed whether or not the so-called heaven's chosen one was the sword god. However, the god of the underworld's explanation dispelled their guesses and concerns. First of all, they could confirm that Kenshin had never been to the planet of origin, and knew nothing about the Chaos Sea, so he was definitely not the one chosen by heaven. If he was the one chosen by heaven, he must have a certain connection with the gate of heavenly path in the depths of the Chaos Sea, and could ignite the eternal flame. But as far as they knew, Kenshin had followed the army of the Shangqing Temple to the depths of the Chaos Sea with the Shura God Emperor, and had seen the gate of heavenly path. Since the gate of heavenly path did not react and the eternal flame was not ignited, it meant that Kenshin was not the one chosen by heaven. The god of the underworld's tone and attitude were very certain. After the temple masters of the pantheon of immortality learned of this news, they dispelled their guesses and thoughts. Following that, the god of the underworld told the temple masters that Kenshin was very ruthless. A few months ago, Kenshin had slaughtered millions of innocent desolate race citizens in order to deal with the Nebula God Emperor in the Taiyu Shrine's territory. Following that, when Kenshin entered the pantheon of immortality's territory, he would use the same method to deal with him. If they did not send strong people to kill Kenshin early, millions of desolate race citizens would suffer. Other than that, the god of the underworld also said many things to discredit Kenshin, and to instigate a conflict between the pantheon of immortality and the Taiyu Shrine. The temple masters of the pantheon of immortality gradually believed the god of the underworld's words. Hence, the Grand Temple Master gave the order to send 4 temple masters and the god of the underworld to lead 5,000 elite godly monarchs to the border between the temple and the unknown. Their primary goal was to kill Kenshin, and then to stop the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine. Chapter 47-49. Inside the pitch-black, eerie divine battleship. A tall man dressed in a black robe and a cloak stood in the divine battleship's cockpit. This mysterious and cold man was the god of the underworld. Although he was already the 6th hall master of the pantheon of immortality, he did not have many desolate race god kings under his command. The battleship he was piloting was personally refined by him. The thousands of elite soldiers on the battleship were also brought by him from the heavenly realm. Although the pantheon of immortality only gave him the title of 6th hall master and did not give him the corresponding treatment, he did not care. He did not complain, nor did he care. This was because he knew that this was the first time he and the pantheon of immortality had worked together. Or, it could be said that he was using the pantheon of immortality. Even if he was confident that he could deal with Kenshin alone and not be assassinated by Kenshin like the other god emperors, he would not do anything without confidence. However, he would never do anything that he was not confident in. He would still use the immortal temple to help him achieve his goal. However, the development of the situation was a little different from what he had expected. How could this be? Even if Dao Xingyun was the 6th hall master of the Taiyu Shrine, the Taiyu Shrine would definitely take revenge for Kenshin's killing of Dao Xingyun to save the shrine's reputation. But, isn't there too many people? Why did they send so many hall masters? The god of the underworld was not a reckless person. He could even be called a hero. His wisdom and strategy were definitely not inferior to Ji Tianxing and the Taiyu Shrine's 1st hall master. Hence, when he saw the Taiyu Shrine's 3 battleships, he guessed that the Taiyu Shrine would definitely send more than 3 hall masters. He muttered in his heart and could not help but guess, is the Taiyu Shrine so persistent in hunting down Kenshin just to avenge Dao Xingyun? It shouldn't be. Dao Xingyun was important, but it wouldn't cost the Taiyu Shrine so much. I'm afraid that the Taiyu Shrine has seen some clues and guessed that Kenshin is the chosen one. That's why they're so determined to get him. Although the god of the underworld had deceived the Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality and made them believe that Kenshin was not the chosen one. But he knew very well that none of the 5 god emperors could be the chosen one. Only Kenshin could be. But now that things had developed to this point, he could only hide and cover it up. He could not let the Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality find out. Swish swish. At this moment he received a message from the 2 palace masters. The 2 Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality asked him what he thought of the current situation and what he should do next. Therefore the god of the underworld thought for a moment and sent a message back to the 2 Hall Masters. The new Hall Master of the Taiyu Shrine was killed by Kenshin. For the sake of their reputation and dignity, the Taiyu Shrine will of course do everything they can to kill Kenshin. But now it seems that the truth of the matter is more than that. The Taiyu Shrine is obviously using this as an excuse to invade our territory under the pretext of killing Kenshin. Otherwise, they wouldn't have crossed the unknown land and entered our territory, and they wouldn't have sent so many Hall Masters. The god of the underworld's reply was not long, but it was very firm. After the 2 Hall Masters received the message, they believed him. They were also very angry about the Taiyu Shrine's actions. Then the 4 Hall Masters discussed telepathically and came to a consensus with the Underworld Temple. They decided to attack first before the Taiyu Shrine could react and force the Taiyu Shrine's fleet back to the unknown land. This was the only way to prevent the enemy from invading the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. In short, the god of the Underworld's attitude and determination was to defend the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. Boom, boom, boom. After a while, the 4 Hall Masters and the Underworld Temple's flagship released divine light pillars that covered the sky at the same time and attacked the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. The 3 Hall Masters were shocked. They were anxious and worried, and they found it hard to believe. They knew the Pantheon of Immortality's Hall Masters. They were not reckless people. But now, the Pantheon of Immortality's fleet attacked so recklessly and did not even give them a chance to negotiate. At this point, the 3 Hall Masters felt helpless. They could only activate the defensive array and counterattack. Bang, 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 bang. The divine powers used by the 2 sides collided in the sky and made deafening noises. All kinds of divine light pillars and dazzling divine arts collided fiercely in the sky, exploding into billions of pieces that scattered between heaven and earth. In the first round of the battle, the Taiyu Shrine's fleet was obviously at a disadvantage. Not only was the defensive light shield of the battleship shattered, but the battleship was also damaged. There were many new dents and cracks on the surface of the battleship. The Pantheon of Immortality had gained the upper hand, so their morale was greatly boosted. The soldiers attacked even more bravely and wanted to completely destroy the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. But the 3 Hall Masters of the Taiyu Shrine were not stupid. They knew that they were weaker than the enemy, so they could not fight head-on. So they chose to retreat strategically and retreated in the direction of the reinforcements. The soldiers of the Pantheon of Immortality did not notice anything wrong and chased after them excitedly. The god of the underworld guessed that the enemy must have reinforcements and it would be dangerous if they continued to chase after them. But he would not warn them. He would rather deepen the conflict between the 2 sides and not care about Kenshin's identity and movements. Just like that, the Pantheon of Immortality's fleet chased after them and continuously released destructive divine powers to attack the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. The 3 battleships of the Taiyu Shrine were humiliated and tortured. They fought and retreated, and the soldiers were frustrated. Finally, the 2 sides moved the battlefield 400,000 miles away. The 3 warships of the Taiyu Temple were riddled with cracks and craters from the bombardment. Even the soldiers on the battleships started to suffer casualties. At this moment, the reinforcements of the Taiyu Shrine arrived. The 2nd Hall Master and the 5th Hall Master were the first to arrive. The 2 divine warships could see the situation on the battlefield clearly even from a distance. So, after the 2 divine warships arrived on the battlefield, they immediately attacked the 5 battleships of the Pantheon of Immortality. The situation on the battlefield immediately became even. Both sides had 5 Emperor God experts and 5 battleships attacking each other. They were evenly matched and neither side had the upper hand. The 4 Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality were shocked and in disbelief. They did not expect that the Taiyu Shrine would send out 5 Hall Masters. They were so powerful. The god of the underworld stepped forward at the critical moment and sent a message to the 4 Hall Masters. asking them to retreat first while he stayed behind to cover the rear. Naturally, the 4 hall masters were very grateful for this and trusted the god of the underworld even more. But they could not do that. They would rather have the 5 battleships attack together and retreat together. So the two sides continued to fight and kill each other. Only the Pantheon of Immortality showed signs of retreating. After 15 minutes, the first hall master of the Taiyu Shrine arrived again. When the first hall master's battleship joined the battle, the situation on the battlefield was completely reversed. Chapter 4750. The first hall master was the strongest and his warship was the most powerful. The Pantheon of Immortality was forced to retreat. They had no choice but to return to their territory as quickly as possible. At the same time, the other hall masters quickly sent messages to the first hall master. The first hall master was shocked and angry when he learned that the Taiyu Shrine's fleet had invaded and that the hall masters had come out in full force. Now that things had developed to this point, the two sides were like fire and water. No matter what the Taiyu Shrine's reason was, sending the hall masters to invade the Pantheon of Immortality's territory was tantamount to declaring war on the Pantheon of Immortality. This was definitely not a misunderstanding or a provocation. It was an invasion and war. The Pantheon of Immortality had been established for tens of thousands of years and had weathered many storms. It was still standing on the continent. How could it be defeated so easily? Even though the Taiyu Shrine was strong, the Pantheon of Immortality was not afraid. The first hall master was furious. He immediately issued several orders to declare war on the Taiyu Shrine. He first ordered the second hall master, third hall master, and the others to retreat to their territory and rest. They were not to fight the Taiyu Shrine's fleet head-on. They were to preserve their strength. Then he issued orders to more than 80 hall masters to gather a large number of elite god kings. He gave a 1-month deadline and ordered the 80 hall masters to gather an army of 100,000 god kings and gather at the western border of his territory. After issuing these orders, the first hall master gathered 5,000 god guards and personally drove the warship to the western border at the fastest speed possible. Since the Taiyu Shrine's first hall master had personally taken action, as the founder of the Pantheon of Immortality, he naturally had to take action as well. It's been 60,000 years. Taiyu God Emperor, the last time I fought you was 60,000 years ago. This time I'd like to see how far your strength has progressed. How dare you be so arrogant? In the speeding warship, the God Emperor's face was gloomy. He stared ahead with sharp eyes and muttered to himself. At the western border of the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, at the border of the unknown land, the 4 hall masters and the god of the underworld were high up in the sky. They were fighting with the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters and covering the retreat of their fleets. They had the upper hand and the 3 hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine were beaten to a pulp. However, when the other 2 hall masters of the Cosmos Sacred Hall arrived, the battle became a draw. Later on, the Grand Hall Master of the Cosmos Temple arrived, and the situation was completely reversed. The 4 temple masters of the Immortal Temple and the Netherworld Divine Emperor were no match for their opponents and could only retreat as they fought. The Hall Master of Immortal Immortality by God. Of Hall Master of Immortal Immortality. Of Hall Master of Immortality of Immortality. The Hall Master of Imto of Immortalities of Hall Master of Immortality to be killed tis, although both sides had suffered casualties, and the number of casualties was not small. Overall, the Pantheon of Immortality suffered more casualties. Not only were the 5 battleships heavily damaged, but even the 4 Hall Masters and the Netherworld Divine Emperor were also heavily injured and in a sorry state. More than half of the elite soldiers under their command were killed or injured. The more desperate the situation was, the more determined they were to escape. This was the order of the immortal God Emperor. He wanted them to conserve their strength as much as possible. If the Temple of Immortality lost 2 temple masters and thousands of elite god kings in this unprepared battle, the Temple of Immortality would be doomed. Then even if the immortal God Emperor personally came to join the battle, he would be powerless. Therefore, the 4 Hall Masters and the god of the underworld were running for their lives. Fortunately, they retreated in time and were determined enough. At the critical moment, they were also determined to cut their losses. They decisively abandoned more than 1,000 soldiers. In the end, the 1,000 or so elite god kings were obliterated by the Cosmos Temple's fleet. Their bones were ground to dust. Their deaths also bought time for the 4 Hall Masters and the god of the underworld, allowing the fleet to escape. The distance between the two sides increased to more than 300,000 miles. If the Taiyu Shrine continued to pursue, the Hallmaster's divine sense would be able to detect the other side and would not be shaken off. However, the Hallmaster chose to stop the pursuit and did not continue to enter the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. This decision puzzled the other Hallmasters. They all sent voice transmissions to ask the first Hallmaster why he was not continuing the chase. The Hallmaster explained to them, "Don't chase a cornered enemy. After all, this is the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. If we continue to pursue, we will soon encounter traps and ambushes. In addition, we have 3 beast lords and tens of thousands of soldiers behind us. If they interfere, we will be in a very passive situation. Most importantly, our goal is to capture the God Emperor, not to attack the Pantheon of Immortality. If we continue to pursue them, we will lose 800 of our own to kill 1,000 of our enemies. That will be the final outcome." After hearing the Hallmaster's words, the other Hallmasters all expressed their understanding. Afterward, the first Hallmaster left with the fleet. He found a lofty mountain range nearby and hid there to rest and recuperate. They would need to recuperate for 4 or 5 days before they could continue to move. When the time came, they would hide their tracks and auras and sneak into the Pantheon of Immortality's territory to search for Zhou Xian. At the border of the unknown lands, Qiankuan, Underworld and Golden Horse Lords were discussing. Although the Beast Race army was hiding in the mountains to recuperate and hadn't made any moves for the time being. However, they had been monitoring the Taiyu Shrine's fleet, so they naturally saw the battle between the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality. At that time, the 11 god monarchs and the 11 battleships from both sides were fighting fiercely in the sky. They fought until divine light splashed and flowers fell from the sky. The 3 beast lords felt their blood boil as they watched, their emotions stirring. Of course, they would not join in the fun, much less participate in the battle. They only hoped that the Hallmasters of the 2 god temples would fight even more fiercely and savagely. It would be best if both sides suffered heavy losses, with all the soldiers on both sides killed and a few Hallmasters killed. That would be perfect. They would only have the opportunity to rise again after the 2 great temples had suffered great losses. For tens of thousands of years, they had been sandwiched between the 2 god temples, carefully surviving. As long as those 2 mountains did not fall, they would never be able to rise again. The 3 lords thought that the 2 god temples' fleets would be evenly matched and could fight for a long time. However, they did not expect that after 2 hours of fighting, the Pantheon of Immortality's fleet would be defeated and flee pathetically. Seeing the Taiyu Shrine's fleet give chase, the 3 lords were still very excited and full of anticipation. However, the Taiyu Shrine's fleet only chased for a few million miles before stopping to find a place to rest. This disappointed the 3 lords and they were filled with regret. What a pity! They fought for so long, but none of the Hallmasters were killed. Although the battle was fierce, those who died were all god kings. Those Hallmasters are fine. After all, they are God Emperor. How can they be killed so easily? They stopped fighting. What should we do? Chapter 4751. Originally, the 3 orc lords wanted to watch the snipe and the clam fight and reap the benefits. However, the outcome did not go as they wished. They were very disappointed and had to discuss their next plan. Underworld and Golden Horse Lord suggested that they lead an army of 10,000 orcs to infiltrate the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and secretly monitor the movements of the 2 temples. In the future, the fleets of the 2 temples would fight again. They could find a suitable opportunity to strike and reap greater benefits. However, this suggestion was rejected by Heaven and Earth Lord. He felt that the motive of the Taiyu Shrine was not pure. It did not seem like they were attacking the Pantheon of Immortality, but more like they were looking for someone. Speaking of looking for someone, the 3 lords thought of Zhou Xian and his Godslayer battleship. Heaven and Earth Lord believed that the Taiyu Shrine would not make a big fuss in order to find someone. They would definitely act secretly. Therefore, the fleet of the Taiyu Shrine would not engage in a large-scale battle with the fleet of the Pantheon of Immortality. If they took a huge risk and led an army of 10,000 orcs to invade the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, the consequences would be too severe. The temple masters of the Pantheon of Immortality would definitely annihilate them at all costs. They did not have a battleship and would definitely not be able to defeat the fleet of the Pantheon of Immortality. They would also not be able to escape when they were chased. In the unknown lands, they would still have the geographical advantage and could contend with the fleets of the two temples. However, if they entered the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality, they would only be passively beaten. Rather than walking into a trap, it would be better to stay at the border of the unknown lands and wait for the rabbit to come out. After listening to Heaven and Earth Lord's analysis, Golden Horse Lord and Underworld Lord nodded in agreement. However, they also suggested that they send a group of spies to infiltrate the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and be responsible for gathering information. This was very necessary. If they did not have spies to gather information, they would not be able to stay at the border of the unknown lands and observe the changes. On the other side, in the south of the unknown lands, the god-slaying battleship flew south for a few days and encountered another city. It was probably because this place was close to the Phoenix Ridge and was located in the center of the region, so the population was higher and the city was more prosperous. This city, with a radius of 100 miles, was located on a fertile grassland. It was built in a rather majestic manner. Not only were there thousands of guards guarding the city, but there was also a powerful divine array. There were more than 1 million citizens living in the city. Most of them were from the beast race. There were also some members of the desolate race and strange alien races. There were many god kings in this city, but there was still no god emperor realm expert. From the architectural style of the city, one could see that it was more influenced by the Protoss. Tianxing retrieved the god-slaying battleship and concealed his presence. He descended from the sky and snuck into the city. He walked around the city a few times and stayed for half a day. After that, he hid in the city lord's mansion and eavesdropped on the conversation between the city lord and a few powerhouses. He even snuck into the library to read some books. Through this series of actions, he finally grasped the information he wanted. That's right, this city was very close to the Phoenix Ridge. The Phoenix Ridge was south of this city, about 20 million miles away. It was a forbidden area and unrelated people were not allowed to approach. On the peak of the Phoenix Ridge, there was a majestic divine palace called the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. It was a sacred ground, a place where billions of citizens believed and worshipped. The powerhouses who lived in that divine palace were the rulers of this region and the protectors of billions of citizens. Although the owner of the Nine-Yang Divine Palace was a powerhouse from a different race, and the tens of thousands of divine guards under him were also from different races. However, all the living beings in this region knew that the Nine-Yang God Emperor never ostracized or belittled other races. As long as they were loyal to him regardless of race, they would be treated well. It was because of this that for more than a decade, all the large and small factions in this region had successively submitted to the Nine-Yang God Emperor. After learning this information, Tianxing left the city in satisfaction. He continued steering the god-slaying battleship and flying south. 4 hours later, the god-slaying battleship arrived near the Phoenix Ridge. It was indeed a mountain range with abundant divine power and rich resources. It was no wonder that the Nine-Yang God Emperor had chosen to build his divine palace here. Within a radius of 10 million miles, there were endless majestic mountain ranges and primeval forests. Among the mountain ranges that undulated like giant dragons, there were peaks that towered tens of thousands of feet high, reaching into the sea of clouds. Many formations had been set up in the mountains and they operated day and night, absorbing divine power from all directions. The closer he got to the Phoenix Ridge, the denser the divine power in the surroundings. Even the clouds that covered the sky had become five-colored. In order to not alert the Nine-Yang God Emperor, Tianxing put away the god-slaying battleship and passed through the sea of clouds alone, approaching the Phoenix Ridge. On the way to the Phoenix Ridge, Tianxing discovered many divine arrays among the mountains. Most of the divine arrays were used to absorb the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, but some of them were traps, ambushes, or warnings. If an uninformed person barged in, even if they were a high-level god king, they would die without a burial place. Even if peak divine kings came and were trapped by those traps and array formations, they would also end up with a fate of being covered in cuts and bruises. It was obvious that the Nine-Yang God Emperor loved his people and welcomed all living beings under his command. But in reality he did not trust them at all and was even on guard against the foreign races. The people he trusted the most were the soldiers he had brought from the divine world, who had always been loyal to him. 2 hours passed. Ji Tianxing crossed hundreds of mountain ranges and dozens of peaks before finally arriving at the Phoenix Ridge. It was an extremely majestic mountain range that stretched for millions of miles. It had a majestic aura. Looking down from the sky, the entire mountain range looked like a soaring phoenix. It was very shocking. At the peak of the mountain range on the back of the phoenix, there was a dazzling palace and courtyard. The divine palace in the middle was the most majestic and dignified. Its appearance was also the most sacred and gorgeous. It was as golden as the sun. Without a doubt, that dazzling palace was the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. The defenses around the Divine Palace were loose on the outside and tight on the inside. On the surface, it looked like there was no defense, but in reality, not only were there a large number of guards, there were also many defensive arrays. Especially in many key places, there were many high-level god kings lying in ambush. They were all god tribes loyal to Lu Zhiyang. Ji Tianxing circled around the Nine-Yang Divine Palace twice. After carefully observing the situation, he was sure that this was Lu Zhiyang's territory. Lu Zhiyang was very cautious, and the Divine Palace's defenses were very strong. But Ji Tianxing believed that he would soon be able to infiltrate the Nine-Yang Divine Palace and find Lu Zhiyang. With his current strength, killing Lu Zhiyang would be as easy as killing Dao Xingyun and the Azure God Emperor. Thus, he secretly used the Divine Eye secret technique to observe the Nine-Yang Divine Palace's defenses. He looked for a weak point and began to break the defensive arrays. Chapter 4752. The Nine-Yang Divine Palace's defensive grand array was also traceable. The outer defensive array was basically a supreme-grade king-level divine array. There were either 6 or 9 stacked divine arrays. The deeper inside, the closer it was to the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, the higher the grade of the divine array and the stronger its power. As for the array protecting the Nine-Yang Divine Palace alone, it was a 2-layer emperor-level divine array. That was the barrier that Ji Tianxing was most worried about. The king-level divine arrays on the outer layer were not difficult for him. After all, they were all king-level arrays and they came from the realm of the gods. He was very familiar with them. Taking advantage of the dark and windy night, he calculated the gaps between the patrolling guards and began to cast his spell. He had already observed the outermost defensive formation and studied it thoroughly. Once he started, he would use his fastest speed to peel the cocoon off the defensive array. In just 20 breaths, he successfully broke open a gap. After that, Ji Tianxing, who was invisible and hiding his aura, turned into a speck of dust. With a whoosh, he passed through the gap and entered the defensive array. The gap in the array quickly healed and was as good as new. There were no signs that it had been broken open. After a few dozen breaths, a group of patrolling guards passed by and did not notice anything unusual. At this time, Ji Tianxing had already arrived near the second defensive array. He hid in the bamboo forest at the corner of the garden. He secretly used the God's Eye secret technique and stared at the second defensive array for a long time. Then he took advantage of the gaps between the patrolling guards to decisively break the array. Although this layer of barrier was formed by 6 king-level divine arrays and had not reached the emperor level, it was extremely complicated and cumbersome. However, Ji Tianxing only used less than 30 breaths to break open this layer of barrier. Whoosh! Without making a sound, he passed through the gap in the formation and went back inside. Next, Ji Tianxing repeated the same trick and used the same method to break 3 layers of barrier consecutively in a few hours. Although each layer of barrier was formed by several divine arrays and had very strong defensive power, it was also very tedious and complicated to break open. However, Ji Tianxing could easily see through them and cast a spell to break them in a very short time. After breaking through several layers of barriers, he was not discovered by the patrolling guards. In the end, he arrived at the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, near the 2 innermost emperor-grade divine arrays. Not only were they the most complicated and difficult of the 2 formations, they were also the Nine-Yang God Emperor's last resort. As long as these 2 divine arrays were still operating normally, the Nine-Yang God Emperor would be safe. No one would be able to threaten him. Of course, over the past decade, no one had been able to break through these 2 divine formations, and no one had been able to threaten his safety. As a result, the Nine-Yang God Emperor let down his guard, and the patrolling guards were no longer as cautious and vigilant as before. Ji Tianxing silently observed the first emperor-level defensive formation, trying to understand its structure and profundity. 2 hours later he had observed and understood everything clearly. While the guards were patrolling, he decisively cast a spell and began to crack the formation. In the end, everything went very smoothly. In just a short 2 hours he had broken through the first layer of the defensive formation. During these 2 hours the patrolling guards had passed by several times. However, he had concealed his whereabouts and aura so that he was not discovered by the patrolling guards. After breaking through the defensive formation, he tore a crack in the formation, turned himself into a speck of dust and casually entered. There were no ripples of divine power, nor was there any sound or movement. Just like that, he had silently entered the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. Next, the only thing that stood between him and the Nine-Yang God Emperor was the last Emperor-level defensive formation. At this time he could even sense Lu Jiayang's divine power aura, as well as the auras of many god kings within the divine palace. Even though he was a little excited, he restrained himself and waited patiently. He began to observe the second divine formation. There was no suspense. The second formation was even more intricate and complex than the first, and it was also more powerful. It could not be helped. This was the final barrier of the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, and it had been personally set up by the Nine-Yang God Emperor. The Nine-Yang God Emperor had always believed that apart from himself and the holders of his tokens, no one could enter or leave this formation. But now Ji Tianxing had used 4 hours of silent observation and research to finally find a way to break the formation. Thus, while concealing his whereabouts and aura, he began to break through the formation. In the process of breaking the array, there were guards constantly patrolling back and forth, and some even passed by him. In addition, the Nine-Yang God Emperor was also in the Divine Palace, accompanied by a large number of higher god kings. If Ji Tianxing leaked the slightest bit of divine power aura or fluctuation while breaking through the formation, he would be discovered by everyone. At that time, not only would he fail at the last step, but he would also be discovered and besieged by everyone. Therefore, when Ji Tianxing was trying to break the formation, he was extremely careful. Of course, he also spent a lot of time. It took him a full 8 hours to break open a chopstick-sized crack in the formation. Whoosh! After the formation was broken, Ji Tianxing did not hesitate at all. He directly passed through the crack and entered the formation. From this moment on, he had truly entered the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. All the halls and rooms in the Divine Palace were no longer guarded against him. Even if there were 2 to 6 god kings guarding every intersection, every door and every room, it was useless to him. He calmed his divine power slightly and stepped into the Nine-Yang Divine Palace with a calm heart. Lu Jiang, I'm here. Are you ready? When he entered the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, this was the only thought in Ji Tianxing's mind. He had already awakened the Hanya God Emperor and had her be on standby at any time, ready to support him. After all, no matter how confident he was, he would not be arrogant to the point of being arrogant. He knew very well that before Dao Xingyun died, he had sent a message to the Nine-Yang God Emperor and the god of the underworld. Therefore Lu Jiang was definitely on guard. Rustle, rustle, rustle. Silently, Ji Tianxing passed through 2 corridors and a courtyard. Even when he passed in front of those God King realm guards, none of them noticed anything unusual. He saw that those guards were expressionless and their minds were in a daze. He also heard the sound of footsteps, coughs, and whispers coming from all over the Divine Palace. He also sensed that there were many god kings lying in ambush in the surrounding darkness, hiding invisible killing intent. But most importantly, he sensed a wisp of the God Emperor's aura hidden in the study. Without any hesitation, Ji Tianxing went straight to the study based on his intuition. In a short while he crossed 2 courtyards and entered the depths of the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, arriving outside the solemn and dignified study. There were 8 god kings guarding the entrance of the study, all of them wearing armor and carrying divine weapons. They were very vigilant and alert. However, Ji Tianxing did not take them seriously at all and directly stepped in front of them. Chapter 4753. Ji Tianxing stood outside the study while the guards were caught off guard. In the spacious and brightly lit study, a tall and burly middle-aged god race man with a dignified appearance was handling official business at his desk. This man wore a dark golden robe and a dazzling golden crown, exuding a noble and powerful aura. He was the ruler of this region, the master of the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, the Nine-Yang God Emperor. In addition to him, there were 2 other middle-aged men from the Protoss in the study. They were both dressed as middle-aged scholars and looked very knowledgeable. These two middle-aged upper divine kings were trusted aides of the Nine-Yang God Emperor. They were advisors that he had brought from the divine world. In the last 10-some years, the Nine-Yang God Emperor had taken root in this unknown land, establishing his own sect and establishing the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. He had never thought of submitting to the four god palaces, nor did he want to compete with the other god palaces for favor like the other 5 god emperors. In contrast, he was starting from scratch. Thus he worked harder than the other god emperors. He had to do his best to develop his faction and strengthen his foundation. He was confident that, given a few hundred or even a few thousand years, he would be strong enough to surpass the 4 god palaces. But right now he was just starting out, and this was the most difficult time. Not only did he have to show tolerance and acceptance, but he also had to show magnanimity. While accepting the various races, he also had to ensure that there were no internal conflicts and disagreements, and he had to find a way to resolve them. Everything was a drain on his mental and physical strength, a waste of his time. As a result, he had very little time to cultivate in seclusion in the last 10-some years. Of the 5 god emperors, he was not the weakest, but he was not the strongest either. At the very least, he was only at the middle god emperor level and had only condensed 4 Tao ripples. This was already very difficult. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Even though it was late at night, the Nine-Yang god emperor was still patiently reviewing memorials under the lamplight. Not long after, he had approved more than a dozen memorials and threw them to the 2 strategists. He said in a deep voice, "This emperor has already taken care of these matters. You just have to follow the instructions on the memorials. Those damned lowly commoners, no matter how detestable and hateful they are, we have to tolerate them at this stage. That's because we still need them. We need them to help this emperor prove this emperor's wise decision." The 2 strategists hurriedly nodded to show that they understood. They took the memorials and bowed to the Nine-Yang god emperor before turning to leave. When they left the study, the Nine-Yang god emperor leaned back in his chair with a tired look on his face. He closed his eyes and rubbed his eyebrows. "I have to deal with these tedious affairs all day long. When will it end? If Tan Yi can break through to the God Emperor realm as soon as possible, with his intelligence and wisdom, it will be enough to help this emperor deal with these matters. At that time I will definitely go into seclusion and cultivate for a few decades." The Nine-Yang God Emperor muttered to himself. However, he did not notice that when the 2 strategists stepped out of the study, an invisible figure also stepped through the door and entered the study. A moment later, the door to the study closed and the room fell into silence. The Nine-Yang God Emperor sighed with emotion. He was about to reinvigorate himself and continue to review the mountainous pile of memorials on the table. At this moment, a faint voice sounded. "Since you are so tired of living, why are you still alive?" This sudden voice of a young man caused the Nine-Yang God Emperor to stiffen and his expression to change. He had to admit that the other party's words made sense. However, he couldn't figure out who had said those words. Who dared to be so bold as to speak nonsense in front of him? And why did this voice sound so familiar? Just as the Nine-Yang God Emperor was in a daze, a dazzling sword light suddenly lit up 10 feet in front of him. Whoosh! It was a golden sword light that was 5 feet long. It appeared so suddenly and came so quickly that no one had expected it at all. The sword light was unparalleled in its sharpness and contained a terrifying aura that made one shiver in fear. The Nine-Yang God Emperor had seen countless experts in his life, and even more so in the way of the sword. However, when this sword appeared, he had an intuition and a premonition in his heart. His consciousness told him that this sword did not come from an unknown expert, but from the man who had made his name with the sword and laughed proudly at the world. Hey, that's right. Only the god of swords, whose name shook the world, could stab out such a terrifying sword, causing one's heart to tremble. Lu Zhiyang had fought with Kenshin before and had even been injured by Kenshin's sword. Thus he had no doubts about the style and power of this sword strike. In the moment of life and death, he had no time to react, dodge or block. The only thing he could do was to gather all of his power in front of his head and chest to form a divine light barrier. This was the shortest and most effective way to save his life. And reality had proven that this move was indeed useful. Boom! Crack! In the next moment, the dazzling golden sword light viciously stabbed into the divine power barrier in front of him, exploding with a deafening boom. Violent energy exploded, carrying with it countless shards of divine power as it scattered in every direction. The bright and spacious study was instantly reduced to rubble, smoke and dust rising into the air. Even the defensive divine array of the study could not withstand such a violent impact and was blasted to pieces. The Nine-Yang God Emperor's divine power barrier was shattered, and his entire body was sent flying by the massive impact. He crashed through the wall of the study and crashed into the rubble on the ground. Of course, this sword strike had not only left him in a sorry state, it had also left him with significant injuries. He had tilted his head in the nick of time, so the sword had not pierced through his head, only his shoulder. By the time he crawled up from the rubble, his right shoulder was bleeding profusely, drenching his golden robe. Kenshin, it really is you. The Nine-Yang God Emperor's reaction was extremely fast. He immediately rushed out of the rubble and flew into the sky. His heart was filled with fear as he glared at Ji Tianxing with eyes as sharp as lightning. He subconsciously shouted these words. Ji Tianxing's guess was correct. Before Dao Xingyun died, he had indeed sent a message to Lu Jiuyang and the God Emperor of the Underworld, informing them of Kenshin's arrival. When Lu Jiuyang heard the news, he was indeed shocked and incredulous. However, after he came to his senses, he analyzed the series of events that followed. He knew that Kenshin would definitely not let them go after coming to the planet of origin. He would definitely seek revenge. Since Kenshin had already killed the Azura God Emperor and Dao Xingyun, it proved that Kenshin's strength was not to be underestimated, and he would definitely be able to kill him. However, he had one advantage, which was that he did not ally with the 4 divine temples, nor did he join any of the divine temples. He had been hiding in an unknown place all this time, gathering beings from all over the world to form his own living beings. In his expectation, Kenshin would definitely seek revenge from the 4 divine temples first, then the other god emperors before coming after him. End of chapter. Chapter 4754. Lu Jiuyang had always thought that he would have at least 3 to 5 years to make sufficient preparations. After all, he was hiding in a very remote and unknown place. Even the other god emperors didn't know where he was hiding. Even if Kenshin came to find him, it would take a lot of time and effort. He wanted to strengthen his forces as much as possible in just a few years and absorb more powerhouses. However, he didn't expect that Kenshin would appear in front of him after leaving the Taiyu Shrine for only a few months. Was it because the heavens didn't open their eyes, or was he just too unlucky? At this time, the two of them were facing each other in the sky above the ruins, their bodies bursting with strong murderous intent. Ji Tianxing was no longer invisible and showed his original appearance. Lu Jiuyang glared at him fiercely and shouted, "Sword God." Back then, the 5 of us spent thousands of years and used so much manpower and material resources to break through the chaotic fog and enter the planet of origin. How did you sneak into the planet of origin alone in such a short time? Ji Tianxing sneered and said, "Of course I followed behind you. That's why I got in so easily. Lu Jiuyang, aren't you just trying to stall for time by talking so much nonsense? Wishful thinking. Tonight will be the day you die." Ji Tianxing shouted coldly and immediately unleashed all his power. He waved the barrier of heaven again and attacked Lu Jiuyang. Whoosh, whoosh. He used a sword technique and released a dozen dazzling golden sword lights, slashing at Lu Jiuyang. The sharp sword lights blocked all of Lu Jiuyang's escape routes, leaving him nowhere to run. Lu Jiuyang was very helpless. He could only use all his strength to form a dazzling divine shield to block the attack of the sword lights. At the same time, he also took out 2 sabers and used the 9-yang divine saber that he was proud of, slashing out more than 25 colored saber lights. Bang, bang, bang. The saber lights and the sword lights collided, creating a dull sound that echoed between heaven and earth. More than 25 colored saber lights were shattered and scattered in all directions. Lu Jiuyang's divine power shield was also shattered, exploding into countless fragments of divine light. The powerful impact once again sent him flying out, tumbling and crashing into the palace. More than half of the palace had collapsed and bricks and debris were scattered all over the ground. When Lu Jiuyang crawled out of the ruins, he was already drenched in blood from head to toe. His disheveled appearance was very wretched. His waist and chest had been penetrated by the sword light, leaving behind 2 hideous and terrifying wounds that were constantly bleeding. Damn it! How could you? Previously it was Ji Tianxing who attacked him. He didn't have time to block or dodge, so it was excusable that Ji Tianxing's sword pierced through his shoulder. But this time he was already prepared. The two of them clashed head-on, but he was unable to resist and was once again injured by Ji Tianxing. This meant that Ji Tianxing's combat strength far exceeded his. He couldn't believe it. He couldn't imagine that the reborn Kenshin was even more heaven-defying than before. Not only did he surpass the God Emperor in just a few hundred years, but he also far surpassed them. In the past he received news that Kenshin had assassinated the Azura God Emperor and Dao Xingyun. He thought that Kenshin had succeeded through trickery. But now it seemed that even if the two of them fought head-on, no one would be able to defeat Kenshin. Since he was sure that he was no match for Kenshin, Lu Jiuyang didn't want to continue fighting and didn't want to be entangled with his opponent. Run. I have to escape from here first. Staying alive is the most important thing. This thought flashed through Lu Jiuyang's mind, and he subconsciously looked at the night sky to his left. Tens of thousands of feet to his left, there was an inconspicuous divine palace that hid one of his trump cards. He estimated that his trump card should have been awakened and it was time to make a move. Just as expected, Ji Tianxing took advantage of the victory to pursue and attack. He once again waved the burial of heaven and attacked Lu Jiuyang. But at this moment, a dazzling cold light lit up in the dark night sky. It carried an unparalleled fierce aura and attacked Ji Tianxing. It was a blade light that was like a cold moon. It was launched by a hazy black shadow and aimed directly at the back of Ji Tianxing's head. The hazy black shadow was also an expert of the God Emperor, and it was best at hiding and assassination. It was born to be one with the night. Even if Lu Jiuyang knew this trump card very well, he wasn't confident that he could neutralize this attack when he wasn't prepared. In a quarter of an instant, the cold moon blade light crossed the distance of tens of thousands of feet and stabbed at the back of Ji Tianxing's head. In the next moment, his head would be pierced by the blade light and he would die on the spot. At the very least, the blade light would be able to pierce through his divine power shield and severely injure him. However, something that Lu Jiuyang didn't expect happened. Ji Tianxing ignored the attack of the hazy black shadow and continued to attack him with all his strength. At the same time, a divine light flashed in the night sky behind Ji Tianxing, and a graceful purple figure appeared. It was a beautiful woman of the God clan. She wore a purple dress and held a divine sword in her hand. Her expression was cold and proud. Her target was the hazy black shadow. Swish! A cold sword light suddenly appeared, illuminating the night sky and dispelling the darkness. It blocked the purple figure and the hazy black shadow. Bang! The cold moon blade light and the cold sword light collided with each other accurately and there was a muffled sound. Then divine light burst out and energy spread everywhere. The hazy black shadow was forced back tens of thousands of feet. It let out a painful groan and hid in the darkness again. The purple figure was also forced back tens of thousands of feet. It stood proudly on the ruins and looked ahead with a vigilant expression, searching for traces of the hazy black shadow. Lu Jiuyang was a little stunned. He stared at the purple figure and couldn't help but exclaim in shock. Damn it! It's you, Panruo. Lu Jiuyang didn't expect that the woman who had blocked Kenshin's fatal attack at the critical moment was the Panruo God Emperor. One had to know that the 5 God Emperors were still in an alliance. Even though the Azura God Emperor and Dao Xingyun were dead, none of them expressed any intention of leaving the alliance. He had thought that the Panruo God Emperor had been killed by Kenshin. But reality slapped him hard in the face. Not only was the Panruo God Emperor not dead, but she had also joined forces with Kenshin. Women. That's women. The ancients didn't lie to me. Only women and villains are difficult to deal with. The shock and disbelief quickly dissipated. The Panruo God Emperor immediately understood the reason. First, the Panruo God Emperor was the only woman in the alliance of the 5 God Emperors. Second, even though the Panruo God Emperor had participated in the encirclement of Kenshin and was one of the Kenshin's murderers, she had still loved Kenshin deeply. A woman who had loved Kenshin deeply, betrayed the alliance of the 5 God Emperors and returned to Kenshin's embrace. Wasn't this normal? At this moment, Lu Jiuyang's heart was filled with anger, hatred, and endless contempt. Chapter 4755. If there was still time, Lu Juyong would definitely question Pan Ruo as to why she was doing this. He would even scold Hanya in disdain, humiliating her until she was covered in cuts and bruises. Unfortunately, he did not have the time. Kenshin was already in front of him. 9 resplendent golden sword beams had sealed off his surroundings, leaving him with no way to escape. He could have taken the opportunity to escape while Stacked Shadow was sneaking an attack on Kenshin. However, he had taken an extra glance at Pan Ruo, causing him to miss his only chance to escape. At this moment, all he could do was use all his strength to conjure a defensive shield and brandish his battle saber to use his best skills. 9 Yang Divine Saber's 6th move, Blazing Sun burns the heavens. Lu Juyong roared angrily as he held the 9 Yang battle saber with both hands. His body emitted a fiery glow as he slashed out a 1,000-foot-long golden blade. He was as dazzling as the blazing sun, illuminating the entire 9 Yang Divine Palace. The terrifyingly high temperature melted all the palace's courtyards and bricks in 100,000 feet radius into magma. All that was left in this region was boundless flames. It was dark red in color. Boom! A quarter of an instant later, the 9 golden sword beams struck the golden blade, producing a loud explosion. The golden blade collapsed, sending out divine light fragments that scattered across the world. 3 of the 9 golden sword lights were shattered, and the remaining 6 sword lights viciously slashed at Lu Juyong. His divine power shield was shattered, sending out divine light fragments that filled the sky. The incomparably violent impact sent him flying backwards, smashing heavily into the dark red lava. Pwah! This time Lu Juyong's injuries were even more serious. When he crawled out of the magma, blood spewed out of his nose and mouth, making him look even more wretched. His face was as white as a sheet, and the golden robes he wore had long become tattered. His divine power had been greatly depleted, causing his combat strength to plummet rapidly. He was in a terrible state. However, he did not lose his rationality, nor did he attack Ji Tianxing in anger. He glanced at the battle situation not far away and saw Pan Ruo God Emperor and Stacked Shadow fighting in the night sky. The 2 figures were constantly flashing before he turned and fled. Folded Shadow was a desolate race God Emperor that he had recruited a few years ago. He was very eccentric. However, he had used many methods and spent a lot of effort to recruit Folded Shadow. Fold Shadow was a hybrid of the Desolate race and the Beast race, but he had offended the 2 divine temples 1,000 years ago. He was not tolerated by Tai Yu and the Pantheon of Immortality. Helplessly, Folded Shadow could only sneak into unknown lands and work with the beasts and other races to survive until now. When Lu Juyong recruited Folded Shadow, he had promised him that when his forces were strong enough to contend against the 2 great temples in the future, he would definitely avenge him. Lu Juyong had never revealed the double shadow to the outside world after taking it as his subordinate. He had always kept it as a trump card and would only use it at a critical moment. Tonight he had no choice but to let Layered Shadow take action. Who would have thought that Kenshin would have come prepared as well? He actually had the Prajna God Emperor take action to tie down the double shadow. Now, Stacked Shadow couldn't even take care of himself and couldn't help Lu Juyong. He could only escape first. Whoosh! Lu Juyong didn't have time to treat his injuries. He suddenly unleashed his divine power and used his instant movement to pass through several layers of defensive arrays and escape into the night sky. However, Ji Tianxing was already prepared. He actually used the space-time blade and cut off the space in front of him with a giant sword. With the space cut off, Lu Juyong naturally couldn't teleport. He could only go around the huge spatial crack. Taking this opportunity, Ji Tianxing chased after him. He brandished the Burial of Heaven and used all kinds of sword Dao techniques, forcing Lu Juyong to retreat again and again. Even though there were thousands of God King guards rushing over from all directions and bravely attacking Ji Tianxing, they weren't strong enough. Even if they attacked without any regard for their own safety, they couldn't do much damage to Ji Tianxing. On the other hand, the shockwaves from Ji Tianxing and Lu Juyong's battle could easily injure them and even kill many guards instantly. The 2 fought for several minutes, passed through several layers of defensive arrays, and left 9 Yang Divine Palace. Even though Lu Juyong had successfully escaped 9 Yang Divine Palace, he was killed by Ji Tianxing because of his severe injuries when he was 100,000 miles away from 9 Yang Divine Palace. Kaboom! A giant golden sword that was as bright as the sun slashed down and drowned Lu Juyong's figure. Lu Zhiyang, who was riddled with wounds and weakened greatly, was cut in half on the spot. He was almost powerless to resist. The divine body that had been tempered thousands of times shattered under the sword light, and blood splattered everywhere. After his head exploded, Lu Zhiyang's godhead was also shattered. 16 pieces of godhead fragments fluttered in the night sky, glowing with divine light. Not far from the battlefield, there were still more than 2,000 god race guards in the night sky, tens of thousands of miles away. They were doing their best to pursue. They were loyal to Lu Zhiyang, and their leader was Lu Zhiyang's last disciple and the former commander of his guards. However, everyone saw the scene of Lu Zhiyang being killed with their own eyes. At this moment, the entire place was silent. Only the dull sound of the explosion still reverberated between heaven and earth. More than 2,000 guards were stunned. Their faces were filled with fear and disbelief. The Nine-Yang God Emperor, who was incomparably powerful and almost invincible in their hearts, was actually killed so easily by someone. Everyone looked at Kenshin, their eyes full of fear and reverence. A moment later, the divine light that filled the sky dissipated. Ji Tianxing waved his hand and grabbed Lu Zhiyang's godhead fragment. At this time, the 2,000 guards came back to their senses. The middle-aged god race man in the lead was called Tan Yi, and he was Lu Zhiyang's last disciple. He suppressed the shock and fear in his heart and shouted, "Quickly retreat. Where there is life, there is hope." Like all the guards, he found it hard to accept Lu Zhiyang's death and hated Kenshin to the core. But at this time he had to maintain his rationality and absolutely could not lead the guards to continue charging. That was not to avenge his master, but to seek his own death and die in vain. What he had to do was to preserve his strength as much as possible and lead all his master's loyal subordinates to get rid of Kenshin's pursuit. They would find a place to live incognito and quietly develop and grow stronger. One day in the future, when he also became a god emperor powerhouse and his forces were strong enough, he would kill Kenshin to avenge his master. Not only Tan Yi thought so, the two middle-aged strategists and several guard commanders also thought so. Thus, everyone came back to their senses and turned around to flee. Only 100 or so of Lu Zhiyang's die-hard followers were unable to accept the fact that Lu Zhiyang was killed. They were so angry that their eyes were about to burst as they roared and rushed toward Ji Tianxing. There was no need to doubt the result. After Ji Tianxing collected the spoils of war, he brandished the Heaven Barrier sword and executed a few divine abilities and lost skills. More than half of the guards were killed and beaten to a pulp. Then he rapidly teleported in the night sky to chase after Tan Yi and the guards. Chapter 4756. Tan Yi and the two strategists could think of preserving their strength first and take revenge after strengthening their forces in the future. Ji Tianxing had come prepared, so how could he not have guessed their thoughts? Even though Tan Yi and those guards could not threaten him for the time being and might not be able to threaten him in the future. But he was used to cutting weeds and eliminating the roots, not leaving any future troubles. Naturally, he had to kill Tan Yi and the rest. Even if he could not annihilate Lu Zhiyang's old subordinates, he had to kill Tan Yi and the two strategists as well as a few guard commanders. After dealing with these leaders, the remaining guards would be like a plate of loose sand. It would be difficult for them to become capable and not be a concern. Swish. In the blink of an eye, Ji Tianxing teleported 30,000 miles and caught up with a group of guards and two guard commanders. Without saying a word, he raised the sword of burial of heaven and slashed out a sword light. It was as if a rain of swords covered the sky and enveloped over 1,000 guards. All the guards turned pale with fright and were filled with fear. Some scattered and fled in all directions. Some used all their strength to condense a shield in a futile attempt to resist, only to hear a series of muffled sounds and explosions. Divine light burst forth in the sky. Bloody light danced in the air. There were also many corpses and debris flying out. Ji Tianxing only used one move and instantly killed over 200 Divine King Realm guards and injured over 100 people. Including those two High Divine King Guard commanders, they also failed to escape this calamity and lost their lives on the spot. Ji Tianxing did not stop. He brandished the sword of burial of heaven and continued to attack. Before long, the remaining few hundred guards were also killed in a disorderly manner. Blood rain filled the sky. Only a few people escaped with their lives. In order not to waste time, Ji Tianxing did not chase after those few guards who escaped. He continued to fly in the direction of Nine-Yang Divine Palace. He chased after Tan Yi and the two strategists as well as over 1,000 guards. Tan Yi and the rest had already fled long ago. When they saw Ji Tianqing slaughtering those guards, they were scared out of their wits and were filled with fear. When escaping, everyone gave it their all. They even did not hesitate to use all kinds of forbidden techniques and divine abilities. However, these people were still unlucky in the end. Hanya God Emperor and Stacked Shadow fought hundreds of moves in Nine-Yang Divine Palace. They were evenly matched. No one could defeat the other. Considering that there were many guards inside and outside the Divine Palace and that there would be an endless stream of reinforcements, Hanya God Emperor could only rush out of Nine-Yang Divine Palace and chase after Ji Tianqing and Lu Zhiyang. Overlapping Shadow didn't hesitate and chased after Pan Ruo God Emperor to the east. However, after flying for tens of thousands of miles, they discovered with their spiritual awareness that Lu Zhiyang had been killed by Ji Tianqing. At that time, Hanya God's spirit, Stacked Shadow's body stiffened and he lost all confidence. He no longer bothered with Pan Ruo God Emperor and turned to flee. Although he had reached an agreement with Lu Zhiyang to secretly join the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. But he had only followed Lu Zhiyang for a few years. He was not that loyal and it was impossible for him to sell his life for the other party. Since Lu Zhiyang was already killed, his agreement with Lu Zhiyang was naturally cancelled. He would definitely not avenge Lu Zhiyang and risk his life against Hanya and Ji Tianqing. Stacked Shadow was good at concealment and assassination. His escape methods were also very brilliant. He hid in the darkness and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. Hanya God Emperor chased for a while. Seeing that Stacked Shadow had escaped far away, she gave up the chase. She was planning to meet up with Ji Tianqing when she ran into Tan Yi and the guards who were fleeing in panic. The result could be imagined. Hanya did not hesitate to brandish her divine sword and started to kill Tan Yi and the guards. The gloomy night sky was immediately filled with dazzling divine light. All kinds of blade lights and sword shadows collided in the air, exploding into countless fragments of divine light. Broken corpses fell from the night sky one after another, accompanied by fragments of divine light. Mournful screams and painful howls also reverberated in the air. Hanya God Emperor was unstoppable. With an unparalleled posture, she wantonly slaughtered those guards. Tan Yi and the two strategists were the smartest. They instigated the guards to besiege Hanya while they took the opportunity to escape. But how could their schemes and actions be hidden from Hanya? Hanya immediately changed her target and went all out to intercept Tan Yi and the two strategists. The powerful divine might of a god emperor enveloped Tan Yi and the two strategists, making it difficult for them to move as if they were trapped in a quagmire. In less than 20 breaths of time, Hanya God Emperor killed more than 100 guards and two strategists. Only Tan Yi was left alive, but his eyes were also full of panic as he fled in panic. At this time, Ji Tianqing finally arrived. As early as tens of thousands of miles away, his divine sense had already locked onto Tan Yi. After rushing into the battlefield, he naturally went straight to Tan Yi. Swish, 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 swish. Another series of Sword Dao divine abilities were unleashed. Sword light filled the sky, enveloping Tan Yi and the dozens of guards beside him. Following a burst of muffled sounds, Tan Yi was minced into pieces by the sword light on the spot. Even the guards beside him were also blasted into dregs, dying without an intact corpse. After dealing with these core figures, Ji Tianqing and Hanya God Emperor joined hands to kill the remaining guards. Everyone collapsed and fled in all directions. They were utterly defeated and retreated without any order. However, thousands of guards fled in different directions. There would still be some fish that escaped the net. Ji Tianqing and Hanya God Emperor chased for 15 minutes and killed more than 800 guards, but more than 100 people still escaped. Of course, if they insisted on chasing after them, they could still kill all the guards. It was just that they didn't want to waste time, so they spared the lives of those guards. The battle in the night sky ended and the world returned to tranquility. The divine light that filled the sky receded, and the night sky returned to darkness. Ji Tianqing and Hanya gathered together. He cast a concerned look at Hanya and asked, "How's your situation? Are you injured?" Hanya God Emperor glanced at him, shook her head and said, "I'm fine." Seeing that she was indeed not injured, Ji Tianqing was relieved and asked again, "Let's go and take a look at Nine-Yang Divine Palace. Let's see how much resources and wealth Lu Zhiyang has plundered these years." It just so happened that he didn't have many cultivation resources on hand. Now that he had killed Lu Zhiyang, he naturally had to loot the treasury and plunder the wealth and resources. Hanya God Emperor shook her head again and said, "I'm not interested. You go by yourself." Since she didn't want to go, Ji Tianqing also didn't force her. He opened the entrance of 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda and let her return to the distorted spacetime to cultivate. Ji Tianqing returned to 9 Yang Divine Palace alone to plunder the spoils of war. At that moment 9 Yang Divine Palace had long fallen into chaos. There were ruins everywhere with broken walls and billowing dust. 80% of the palaces and buildings had been destroyed. The Divine Guard's main forces had also been wiped out. Even though there were still more than 10,000 living beings in 9 Yang Divine Palace, they had long fled. Most of the living beings were from the beast race with a small number of desolate race and other races. They had pledged allegiance to 9 Yang Divine Palace for various reasons. They had only been loyal to Lu Zhiyang for more than 10 years, so it was impossible for them to be too loyal. Therefore, after the battle many people had secretly fled. When Ji Tianqing returned to the sky above the ruins, there were only about 2,000 living beings left in 9 Yang Divine Palace. Furthermore, there were many people plundering the treasures, preparing to flee with the treasures. Chapter 4757. The alien life form's thoughts were simple. 9 Yang Divine Palace had only been established recently, and its foundation was not yet stable. If it suddenly encountered a disaster, it would most likely be heavily damaged or destroyed. Since that was the case, they might as well take the opportunity to sweep away the treasures. While leaving the danger, they could also prepare for the future. However, they neglected one thing. After the 9 Yang God Emperor had established this faction, he understood the importance of wealth and resources better than anyone else. Therefore, the treasury of 9 Yang Divine Palace was more heavily guarded than any other place, and there were more defensive formations set up. The alien life forms tried all sorts of methods, but they were unable to break into 9 Yang Divine Palace's treasury. Even the guards guarding the treasury had left their posts for various reasons, and some had even fled for their lives. However, the greedy alien life forms were still attacking the defensive formations with all their might, trying to break into the treasury and plunder all sorts of resources and treasures. Ji Tianqing looked down at the scene. After seeing this, he did not waste any words and directly released his vast divine might. Whoosh! Immediately, the divine might belonging to a celestial emperor powerhouse enveloped the entire 9 Yang Divine Palace. All the life forms within a radius of tens of thousands of miles were startled awake. This included the alien life forms who were attacking the defensive formations and the treasury in a frenzy, wanting to plunder the treasures. All the living beings raised their heads and stared at the sky in astonishment, staring at Ji Tianqing. They were all stunned. They had not expected such a terrifying powerhouse to appear at this juncture. In an instant many people understood. That unfamiliar alien powerhouse was a God Emperor. Moreover, it was the God Emperor who had attacked and killed the 9 Yang God Emperor. Since this God Emperor had appeared and the 9 Yang God Emperor was nowhere to be found, that meant the 9 Yang God Emperor had been defeated. The meaning of defeat was very broad. It could mean that Lu Zhiyang had been defeated and had fled with serious injuries. It could also mean that Lu Zhiyang had been killed and had fallen. Therefore, most of the life forms were very smart and decisively chose to flee. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Countless beams of divine light lit up the night sky. They were like shooting stars flying as fast as lightning into the distance. Within the span of 2 breaths, 70% of the non-humankind beings had fled. However, nearly 30% of the non-humankind beings were either unrepentant, greedy, or unaware of the severity of the situation. They were still in the 9 Yang Divine Palace and were not even willing to give up on the treasury. Ji Tianqing frowned and released a cold, killing intent that once again enveloped the entire Divine Palace. This time, even a fool would understand that if they didn't retreat, their lives would be in danger. The God Emperor's display of divine might was only a warning. And now, the God Emperor was thoroughly enraged, clearly displaying his killing intent. If they didn't leave, there was only one outcome for them, and that was to be killed by the God Emperor. Thus, the remaining 30% of foreign beings also fled with their tails between their legs. Even if there were a few non-humankind beings who weren't afraid of death, they still remained in the 9 Yang Divine Palace, unable to pose any threat to Ji Tianqing. Ji Tianxing casually sent out a few rays of sword light, locking onto those foreign beings and insta-killing them. It wasn't that he was cruel and bloodthirsty, but that those foreign beings were deranged and had a reason for their deaths. At this point there was no one else in the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. Ji Tianxing landed outside the treasury. Even he had to think of a way to break the defensive formation before he could enter the treasury. There was no doubt that the defensive formation of the treasury was composed of an Emperor-grade divine formation and many Supreme-grade divine formations. Ji Tianxing spent 2 hours to break the Emperor-grade defensive formation. After that he didn't need to waste too much time and energy to break the Supreme-grade divine formations. 4 hours later, Ji Tianxing successfully entered the Nine-Yang Divine Palace's treasury. Most of the guards guarding the treasury had fled without a trace, their whereabouts unknown. Even if there were a few guards left, they were no match for Ji Tianxing and were instantly annihilated. Next it was time for Ji Tianxing to collect the spoils of war and count his gains. The treasury hidden deep underground was, in fact, an alternate dimension. All kinds of cultivation resources, treasures and materials were piled up like mountains in the treasury, forming mountain ranges. Ji Tianxing didn't stand on ceremony and put all of them into his spatial ring. Of course, while collecting all kinds of cultivation resources and treasures, he didn't forget to count the value of the various resources and treasures. This process took him a total of 6 hours. 6 hours later he left the treasury of Nine-Yang Divine Palace and flew into the distant night sky. This time his attack on Phoenix Ridge and Nine-Yang Divine Palace could be said to have reaped great rewards. Not only did he kill his old enemy, the Nine-Yang God Emperor, taking revenge, but he also collected hundreds of trillions of cultivation resources. This was despite the fact that the Nine-Yang God Emperor had only ruled this region for a dozen or so years. But in the past dozen or so years he had been constantly attacking cities and conquering various tribes and factions. Every time he conquered and won he would obtain vast amounts of cultivation resources and treasures. Those hundreds of trillions of cultivation resources and treasures could be said to be the accumulation of the Nine-Yang God Emperor over the past dozen or so years. Originally, the Nine-Yang God Emperor had hoped to use those cultivation resources and treasures to expand his forces. But he didn't expect that in the end, before he could fulfill his wish, he would be killed by Ji Tianxing. After leaving the Nine-Yang Divine Palace's territory, Ji Tianxing returned to the god-slaying battleship and flew east. The plan he had previously devised had not changed. He was still going to pass through the unknown lands and rush to the Pantheon of Immortality's territory to find the god of the underworld. At this point he had already killed 3 of his old enemies, the 5 god emperors. Excluding the Prajna god emperor, his only enemy left was the god of the underworld. When he was able to kill the netherworld divine emperor, he would be able to take his revenge and wipe out his hatred. But this matter was definitely not that simple, and he had long been mentally prepared. After leaving the unknown lands, even if he entered the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, he had to be careful. A few hours later, the god-slaying battleship was far away from the Nine-Yang Divine Palace. At this time, the battleship had already been replaced by the White Dragon. Ji Tianxing had already returned to the distorted space-time to count the spoils of war. The cultivation resources and treasures he had plundered from the Nine-Yang Divine Palace were just some supplementary items. In fact, his greatest gain this time was Lu Jiayang's Divine Spark Fragment, Lu Jiayang's Spatial Ring, and the Emperor-grade Divine Artifact he had left behind. After Lu Jiayang was killed, his Spatial Ring became an ownerless item and Ji Tianxing could open it at will. He spent a few hours looking through Lu Jiayang's Spatial Ring. The results were just as he had expected. The treasures and cultivation resources that Lu Jiayang valued the most were indeed hidden in the spatial ring. The resources and treasures he had plundered from the treasury were only worth a few 100 trillion. And the cultivation resources and treasures hidden in Lu Jiayang's spatial ring were worth more than 500 trillion. Chapter 4758. The cultivation resources and wealth that Ji Tianxing had accumulated in the past were only enough for his subordinates to use for another 200 to 300 years. Now that he had obtained Lu Jiayang's life savings and the wealth that he had painstakingly plundered, he could double the time. In the short term, Ji Tianxing did not have to worry about cultivation resources for the time being. He took out 2 more spoils of war and examined them carefully. One was Lu Jiayang's battle saber, a true emperor-level divine weapon that had not been damaged in the battle. After Lu Jiuyang's death, this battle saber had become an ownerless item. Ji Tianxing temporarily kept it for future distribution. The battle saber also had an internal space. It was like a small world that could accommodate hundreds of billions of living beings. When Lu Jiuyang first came to the planet of origin, he had brought 50,000 elite soldiers with him. After ruling the unknown lands and establishing the Nine-Yang Divine Palace, Lu Jiuyang had selected 10,000 elites to serve as the palace's guards and carry out orders and missions. The remaining 40,000 soldiers were all left in the internal world of the Divine Saber to peacefully reproduce and cultivate. After Ji Tianxing obtained the Nine-Yang Battle Saber, the 40,000 soldiers in the internal world were still unaware of the changes in the outside world. They also did not know that Lu Jiuyang had been killed. Just like Dao Xingyun's situation, after Dao Xingyun was killed, the soldiers under his command were also unaware. Ji Tianxing temporarily ignored the 40,000 soldiers in the Nine-Yang Battle Saber. He would deal with them when the time was right in the future. After all, he had used a few days to refine the Nine-Yang Battle Saber. As long as he did not take the initiative to open the internal world of the Battle Saber, the 40,000 soldiers would not be able to come out. The second spoil of war was Lu Jiuyang's divine warship. This was also Lu Jiuyang's natal divine weapon. It was also an emperor-level divine weapon. Ji Tianxing already had the god-slaying battleship. Therefore, after killing Dao Xingyun and Lu Jiuyang, he had obtained 2 emperor-level battleships but had no use for them. He decided to spend a few decades repairing and modifying the 2 battleships to improve the quality and power of the battleships. After the 2 battleships were modified, he would give them to Yun Yao and Jiku. If he had time in the future, he would reforge Lu Jiuyang and Dao Xingyun's weapons and modify them to suit Yun Yao and Jiku. After all, those spoils of war were all emperor-level divine artifacts. It would be a waste to break them down into refining materials. He could only modify them and continue to use them. Ji Tianxing then started to refine Lu Jiuyang's godhead fragments. Among the many spoils of war, this was the most important one. White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship toward the east at a leisurely pace. However, after flying east for 8 days, he received an order from his master. So, he controlled the God-Slaughter battleship to hide in a desolate and dangerous mountain range, and he went underground to lay dormant. In this region, there were no desolate race, beast race, or other races in a radius of millions of miles. The deity-slaying battleship was hiding here to rest and reorganize. There was no need to be afraid of being discovered or disturbed. Time passed silently. In the unknown lands and the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, there were undercurrents surging. Unknown changes were happening. The 3 beast race territorial lords were still guarding the borders of the unknown lands with their 10,000 beast race elites. They had made up their minds. As long as nothing unexpected happened, they would not leave the unknown lands. On the other side, the 6 hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine had already entered the Pantheon of Immortality's territory with their battleships. In order to expand their search area and increase their search efficiency, they had split into 2 fleets. One was led by the first hall master, while the other was led by the second hall master. Both fleets concealed their tracks and auras. They searched the Pantheon of Immortality's territory for information regarding Ji Tianxing. The results were indisputable. They had exhausted all their means and methods and spent 2 months, but they were unable to obtain any useful information. At the same time, the Pantheon of Immortality's first hall master led thousands of elite godly kings and rushed to the western region. Under his orders, the various hall masters gathered a large number of elite soldiers and rushed to the western border to be on standby. The battle at the border had ended long ago. The god of the underworld and the 4 hall masters had retreated to a safe area and rested for 2 months. Most of the soldiers' injuries had stabilized, and their combat strength had recovered greatly. Now the immortal god emperor had arrived with reinforcements. They could regroup and fight the Taiyu Shrine's fleet again. However, they searched the entire border but could not find the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. The 6 hall masters had disappeared without a trace. This made the immortal god emperor very angry. He cursed the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters from head to toe. He had mobilized tens of thousands of elite soldiers and gathered them from the various branches to the western border in order to fight a great battle against the Universe Temple. However, the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters had slipped away and disappeared without a trace. What was this? The immortal god emperor naturally knew that the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters had come with ill intentions. They would not let this matter rest. Even if the 6 warships had disappeared, they would not have retreated to an unknown place and returned to the Taiyu Shrine. There was a 95% chance that they had infiltrated the Pantheon of Immortality's territory. This thought infuriated the immortal god emperor and filled his heart with worry. The Taiyu Shrine has turned out in full force. If they had come to fight us, then I would have had a chance to deal with them. In my territory I could have gathered thousands of soldiers and fought them to the end. However, they have snuck into my territory and disappeared without a trace. They must be plotting something. Even if they did not resort to any tricks, killing and looting everywhere, they could have caused chaos in my hall and made the people panic. However, they can come and go like ghosts and escape as they please. It is not easy for me to catch them. Alas. The immortal god emperor's heart clenched at the thought that the Taiyu Shrine's hall masters could bring great disaster and turmoil to the Pantheon of Immortality. However, since things had developed to this point, he had no choice but to passively respond and act according to the circumstances. He first ordered the various halls to tighten their defenses and increase their patrols and vigilance. Once there was an abnormal situation, they were to report it immediately. Then he ordered the hall masters to lead thousands of elite god kings to the various halls to search for the Taiyu Shrine's fleet. Once they found traces of the fleet, they were not to alert the enemy. They only needed to report the information. As long as the 6 hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine dared to break up and cause trouble in the Pantheon of Immortality's territory, the immortal god emperor was confident that he could annihilate them one by one. Thus, the powerhouses of the 2 halls began to secretly compete with each other. The Pantheon of Immortality seemed calm at the moment, but in reality there were already undercurrents surging. A storm was brewing. This was especially true for the dozen or so halls in the west. They could feel the stifling atmosphere before a great battle. Many hall masters and powerhouses had guessed that a great battle would break out soon. Chapter 4759. The god-slaying battleship lay dormant in the southeast of the unknown lands for 3 whole months. 3 months later, the Pantheon of Immortality was surging with undercurrents. A great battle was imminent. Ji Tianxing had been in seclusion for more than 12 years in the distorted spacetime of the 9 Heavens 10 Absolutes Pagoda. During these 12 years he first refined Lu Jiayang's Godhead fragment. After that, not only did he obtain a huge amount of divine power, but he also absorbed more than 100 types of divine Tao nomological laws and Lu Jiayang's divine soul memories. Ji Tianxing's strength naturally increased. The number of divine Tao nomological laws he grasped was also getting closer and closer to 3,000. He was looking forward to the day when he condensed 3,000 great Taos. After finishing his cultivation, he also refined and modified Dao Xingyun and Lu Jiayang's divine battleships. The power and quality of the 2 divine battleships increased. Then he handed them to Yun Yao and Jiku. Yun Yao and Jiku had been following him all this time. They were either in the distorted space-time or in the god-slaying battleship. They basically did not need the divine battleships. However, there was no harm in being prepared. He prepared 2 divine battleships for the 2 of them. They could be used as weapons at critical moments. After settling the matter of the 2 divine battleships, Ji Tianxing took out Lu Jiayang and Dao Xingyun's natal divine weapons and modified them. He used the 2 divine weapons as a foundation and added a large number of top-notch materials to reforge the 2 divine weapons. In the end, he refined the 2 divine weapons into a divine spear and a divine sword. He gave them to Yun Yao and Jiku respectively. The power of these 2 divine weapons had increased. They could greatly increase Yun Yao and Jiku's combat power. By the time Ji Tianxing finished all these things, 12 years had already passed. He then ordered White Dragon to control the god-slaying battleship and rush to the Pantheon of Immortality. White Dragon had cultivated in the distorted spacetime for 12 years. His strength had increased again. His chances of breaking through to the God Emperor realm were getting higher. After receiving the order, he quickly controlled the god-slaying battleship and left the depths of the underground, heading straight east. Ji Tianxing and White Dragon both thought that since the incident had happened 3 months ago, the news must have died down by now. The hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine either fought with the Pantheon of Immortality or returned to the Taiyu Shrine empty-handed. However, this was only a conjecture between the master and disciple. There was no way to confirm it, so they still had to be careful. When White Dragon steered the god-slaying battleship, he still concealed his tracks and aura. He was extremely cautious. Half a month later, the god-slaying battleship passed through the unknown lands and successfully entered the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. Of course, in front of them was the southern region of the Pantheon of Immortality, which was not far from the southern border. Just as Ji Tianxing expected, the Pantheon of Immortality and the experts of the Taiyu Shrine would never have imagined that he would enter the Pantheon of Immortality from here. No matter how many experts the two shrines had, how many defense lines they set up, and how many scouts and spies they arranged, it was impossible for them to monitor this place. The god-slaying battleship shuttled through the southern region of the Pantheon of Immortality as if it was entering uninhabited land. It passed through one shrine after another without being discovered by anyone. Ji Tianxing's target was the god of the underworld. In the past, the god of the underworld and the Pantheon of Immortality had not really formed an alliance. However, Ji Tianxing could predict that once the god of the underworld knew that he was coming for revenge, he would have no choice but to form an alliance with the Pantheon of Immortality to strengthen his own forces. Moreover, the god of the underworld would use flowery words and distort the truth to rope in the experts of the Pantheon of Immortality to deal with him together. Therefore, if he wanted to find the god of the underworld, he had to first find the headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality. The god-slaying battleship flew through the southern region of the Pantheon of Immortality, but it was heading north. On the way, every time they passed by a shrine, Ji Tianxing would put away the god-slaying battleship and personally go to find out more information. The leader and deputy leader of each shrine were all peak divine kings. They were the most powerful experts. With Ji Tianxing's strength and methods, he could easily sneak into the headquarters of each shrine to find out more information. He could also eavesdrop on the conversations of the leaders and deputy leaders without being discovered. Although it was a waste of time, the benefits were obvious. The god-slaying battleship flew north for half a month. After passing through 5 shrines, Ji Tianxing found the information he needed. A few months ago, after we shook off those idiots from the Taiyu Shrine, they really went straight to the Pantheon of Immortality in the east. They set up traps and ambushes at the border of the unknown lands. They wanted to wait for us to come. Unexpectedly, the 4 leaders of the Pantheon of Immortality and the god of the underworld rushed to the border of the unknown lands. The god of the underworld had long guessed that I would seek him for revenge, so he decided to strike first. However, they didn't expect that they would meet at the border of the unknown lands. Without any preparation, they fought for several hours. In the cockpit of the god-slaying battleship, Ji Tianxing's lips curled into a cold smile. He told Bai Long about the information he had gathered. Bai Long listened with great interest. He was full of anticipation as he asked, "What happened after that? What was the result of the battle? Did the leaders of the Taiyu Shrine retreat?" Ji Tianxing shook his head. He continued, "The 6 leaders of the Taiyu Shrine gathered together. Even the God Emperor of the Taiyu Shrine personally took action. How could the 4 leaders of the Pantheon of Immortality be their match? Netherworld and the 4 leaders were beaten back. They retreated to the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and rested in one of the western branches. When the God Emperor of the Immortal God Emperor received the news, he was furious. Not only did he personally lead thousands of elites to the western border to reinforce them, he also ordered dozens of branches to mobilize their elite god kings. He wanted to gather an army of 100,000 to fight the Taiyu Shrine. The result was obvious. By the time the God Emperor of the Immortal God Emperor and his elite troops arrived, the leaders of the Taiyu Shrine had already disappeared without a trace. Bai Long immediately understood what he meant. He asked, "Master, you mean the 6 leaders of the Taiyu Shrine didn't retreat? They sneaked into the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality and are still searching for us?" Ji Tianxing nodded. "That's right. The people of the Taiyu Shrine are looking for us, and we are looking for the god of the underworld. Netherworld and the God Emperor of the Immortal God Emperor are searching for the people of the Taiyu Shrine. At the same time, they are also looking for us." Bai Long frowned. His expression became serious. "That means the people of both shrines are looking for us. We can't expose ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be besieged by them. Now, we can only think of a way to let them kill each other and then reap the benefits." Ji Tianxing nodded slightly. "This is the most ideal situation. It would be best if it could be realized. But in fact, it's very difficult to carry out this plan. We need to be patient enough to find an opportunity. Bai Long suddenly thought of something. His eyes lit up. He reminded, Master, since the God Emperor of the immortal God Emperor is rushing to the western border, doesn't that mean the headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality is empty? If we rush to the headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality and create some chaos, the God Emperor of the immortal God Emperor will definitely rush back. Chapter 4760. Actually, Ji Tianxing had already thought of the idea that White Dragon had suggested. The reason why the deity-slain battleship kept flying north was because it was heading towards the headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality. The situation was very clear. The god of the underworld and the Pantheon of Immortality were currently active in the western region, searching for enemies everywhere. The 6 Taiyu Shrine Hall Masters were also searching for people in the western region, but they were doing it secretly. The western region's branches could become a battlefield at any time. If Ji Tianxing rushed over at this time, he would definitely be caught in the whirlpool and be besieged by enemies. No matter who won between the Taiyu Shrine and the Pantheon of Immortality, he would definitely be the first to be defeated and killed. Therefore, no matter how much he wanted to take revenge on the god of the underworld, he could only hold back for now. He needed to wait for an opportunity for the god of the underworld to be separated from the other hall masters, or even be alone before he could attack. Or he could create an opportunity. If the god of the underworld was unwilling to be separated from the other hall masters, he could destroy the headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality, create chaos, and force the hall masters to rush back to the headquarters. Even if he did that, he would definitely expose his whereabouts and let the other party guess that he was the one behind it. But he had plenty of time to hide or even set up an ambush in advance. The deity-slaying battleship maintained its stealth mode, hiding its divine power and aura as it flew north. On the way, White Dragon remained vigilant and alert, while Ji Tianxing was still in seclusion training in the distorted spacetime. The headquarters of the Pantheon of Immortality was located in the central region of the territory, on the Autumn Wind Ridge, known as the Immortal Shrine. Ji Tianxing had already found out that there were more than 10,000 people living in the Immortal Shrine. 90% of them were from the Desolate race and some of them were from other races. Among them there were 6,000 guards, all of whom were at the Godly King realm. The other 4,000 servants were at the Godly Lord realm. The commander of the thousands of guards was a peak divine king. There were 2 other generals who were also peak divine kings. Other than the god of the underworld and the temple masters, there were no other god emperor level powerhouses. Therefore, if Ji Tianxing wanted to infiltrate the indestructible celestial palace, those guards and commanders wouldn't be able to pose a threat to him. It was estimated that only the emperor-level defensive array of the divine palace could cause him some trouble. As time passed, the god-slaying battleship got closer and closer to the immortal palace. At this time, the situation in the western region of the Pantheon of Immortality had become increasingly tense. Just last night, the god of the underworld and 2 hall masters led thousands of elite divine kings to patrol the territory of one of the halls. They discovered something strange. In that city, they actually discovered the divine energy fluctuations and aura left behind by the god emperor. What did this mean? Not long ago, perhaps even within the last 2 hours, a god emperor powerhouse had come here and cast a spell to search the entire city. This discovery made the god of the underworld and the 2 hall masters very excited. They immediately entered a state of combat readiness. What they could be sure of was that their hall masters hadn't searched this place before. Therefore, the one who left behind the divine energy fluctuations and aura in this city must be a powerhouse from the Taiyu Shrine or Kenshin. While the god of the underworld and the 2 hall masters were excited, they also began a careful and meticulous search. They could guess that the other party hadn't gone far after searching this city. It was even possible that they hadn't left the city yet. The god of the underworld was in charge of searching the interior of the city. The 2 hall masters were in charge of searching the outside of the city for the god emperor powerhouse. The 4,000 elite divine kings that accompanied them quickly moved out and surrounded the entire city. The result was shocking to everyone, even to the point of disbelief. More than 4,000 elite godly kings had just sealed off the entire city when there was a disturbance within the city. The god emperor powerhouse who had left behind the divine energy fluctuations had indeed not left the city. Sensing the presence of the god of the underworld and the two hall masters, as well as the movements of the several thousand elite divine kings, the god emperor powerhouse hiding in the city had no choice but to quietly leave the city. The other party didn't want to meet the god of the underworld and the others face to face, nor did they want to fight here. But the city had already been sealed off, and the defensive formation had been activated. If they wanted to rush out of the city, they had to break the formation. Although the defensive formation of the city wasn't of a very high grade, only a supreme grade king-level divine formation. For a powerhouse like the God Emperor, breaking such a formation wasn't difficult at all. But when the other party broke through the defensive formation, there was an even more intense divine energy fluctuation, and it caused a certain amount of commotion. The god of the underworld sensed it and immediately rushed over to investigate. The other party was anxious and no longer concealed himself. He directly used a secret technique and forcefully broke through the defensive formation. Boom. Crack. Following an earth-shattering explosion, a huge hole was blasted open in the defensive array. Fragments of divine light filled the sky, and the protective shield within a radius of dozens of miles shook violently. The civilians in the city, as well as the elite divine kings who had sealed off the city, were all given a fright. Whoosh. Then, a dazzling beam of divine light shot out of the hole in the formation like an arrow and fled the city. Whoosh. The golden beam of divine light streaked across the night sky like a shooting star and fled into the distance. The god of the underworld didn't hesitate at all. He also passed through the hole in the defensive formation and chased after it as quickly as possible. Although the other party was enveloped in divine light and his appearance couldn't be seen clearly, he was certain. The god of the underworld was certain that the other party had the strength of a middle-level god emperor. If the other party had several god emperors acting together, then they were most likely the hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine. But the other party was acting alone. The god of the underworld was very confident that the other party was a Kenshin. It was precisely because of this that he was so proactive, chasing after them without any regard for his own safety. The other two hall masters were taken aback. They had originally planned to search outside the city, but they didn't expect the situation to take such a sudden turn. Since the other party had exposed himself, there was no need for them to search. They hurriedly followed the god of the underworld and chased into the distance. The 4,000 elite god kings were the ones who were truly stuck between a rock and a hard place. They had just arranged their formation and sealed off the entire city when the enemy appeared on their own accord. Since the hall masters in the lead had chased after them, they should also follow. But the hall masters didn't give the order. These divine kings didn't know whether to seal off the city or chase after them. Just as the commanders were hesitating, a communication jade slip flew over. It was an order from the fourth hall master. He wanted them to abandon the city and hurry over to help. Thus, the commanders didn't dare to hesitate any longer. They hurriedly gathered the divine kings and boarded the divine ship to chase after the two hall masters. This sudden turn of events caused the commoners in the city to panic. While the god of the underworld and the two hall masters were chasing after the divine light, they didn't forget to send a message to report to the immortal god emperor. As for the divine light, it was actually the fifth hall master of the Taiyu Shrine. He, the fourth hall master and the second hall master formed a team to search for Ji Tianxing's whereabouts in this area. In order to increase efficiency, they split into 3 groups after arriving at the hall master's branch and searched each city simultaneously. Chapter 4761. The fifth hall master of the Taiyu Shrine wanted to leave as soon as possible after searching the city. He also remembered the Lord Hallmaster's instructions, so he acted cautiously. He did not dare to be blatant in case he left too many traces. But he did not expect to be so unlucky. He had just used a secret technique to detect auras when he ran into the Pantheon of Immortality. Moreover, the Pantheon of Immortality was so cautious. 3 hallmasters came with thousands of elite immortal kings. This made the fifth hallmaster worried and anxious. At the critical moment, he could only break through the defensive formation and run for his life. After he escaped the city, he would definitely be hunted down by the Pantheon of Immortality. So he ran to the southwest to meet up with the second hallmaster as soon as possible. While he was running, he sent a message to the second hallmaster and the fourth hallmaster, asking them to come to his aid. While he was running, the fifth hallmaster had mixed feelings. He was disappointed and depressed. Why am I so unlucky? We were all on the same mission. Why did I run into the pantheon of immortality and expose my whereabouts? Now not only is my whereabouts exposed, but the second Hallmaster and the fourth Hallmaster are also involved. The Lord Hallmaster's plan is affected. He will definitely punish me. Even if he was being hunted down by the god of the underworld, the fifth Hallmaster was not worried about his own safety. He was afraid of being punished by the Lord Hallmaster. As for his own safety, he was not too worried. After all, the god of the underworld who was hunting him was only at the middle level of the god emperor, which was about the same as him. Even if the god of the underworld was chasing him with all his might, it would be difficult for him to close the distance between them. The distance between them was always about 30,000 miles. The fifth Hallmaster calculated silently. He only needed to hold on for 6 hours, and the second Hallmaster would come to his aid. The second Hallmaster was very powerful. If he joined forces with the second Hallmaster, even if the 3 Hallmasters of the Pantheon of Immortality attacked him together, he would not be afraid. While these thoughts flashed through his mind, the fifth Hallmaster did not slow down. On the other side, the god of the underworld and the 2 temple masters were also in the process of chasing with all their might. Many thoughts flashed through their minds. The first question that the 3 of them considered was, who was that guy running for his life in front of them? Which Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine? Or the Kenshin they were looking for? Of course, the god of the underworld hoped that the other party was a Kenshin. That way he could use this opportunity to kill the other party once and for all. If the other party was a Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine, then he wouldn't be interested. As for the 2 shrine masters behind the god of the underworld, they didn't really care who they were. After all, they were enemies that they had to get rid of. Unknowingly, an hour had passed. The 4 god emperors chased each other through the night sky for tens of millions of miles, and their divine power was depleted to varying degrees. At this moment, it was difficult for the 5th Hallmaster, who was at the front, to maintain his disguise. His divine power aura became even more obvious. The god of the underworld, who had been following him from behind and maintaining a distance of 30,000 miles, finally used his divine sense to investigate clearly. After seeing the other party's appearance and confirming the other party's divine soul aura, the god of the underworld revealed a look of deep disappointment. He had thought that the other party was a Kenshin. He didn't expect it to be a Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine, and the one with a lower status. For a moment the god of the underworld wanted to give up, turn around and leave. But logic told him that he couldn't do that. If he turned around and left, it would be tantamount to declaring to the Pantheon of Immortality that he only cared about his own interests and didn't care about the Pantheon of Immortality at all. One could only imagine how the Pantheon of Immortality would treat him. He had used all his schemes and methods to form an alliance with the Pantheon of Immortality and instigated the Pantheon of Immortality to help him deal with the Kenshin. How could he give up halfway? Thus, the god of the underworld could only suppress his disappointment and continue to chase after the 5th Hallmaster. The 2 Hallmasters behind the god of the underworld were slightly stronger. After an hour of chasing, they had already caught up with the Netherworld Divine Emperor and were now on the same path as him. They had also used their divine senses to clearly see that the god emperor fleeing in front of them was the Taiyu Shrine's 5th Hallmaster. However, they weren't disappointed. Instead, they were even more excited and expectant. Speed up and catch up to him. We can't let that guy escape. Those bastards from the Taiyu Shrine, how dare they come to our territory and behave so atrociously? We'll make sure they don't return. The first Hallmaster's strategy is too good. We can't fight the Taiyu Shrine head-on. We have to annihilate them one by one. Kill the 5th Hallmaster first. It's equivalent to cutting off one of the Taiyu Shrine's fingers. If this guy can attract reinforcements, we'll kill him first and then kill the Hallmaster who comes to support him. The 2 Hallmasters discussed telepathically as they sped up. Their hearts were filled with anticipation. They had already reported the news to the immortal God Emperor. They believed that the immortal God Emperor would bring the other 2 Hallmasters and rush over as quickly as possible. In 2 days at the latest, the 6 Hallmasters of the Pantheon of Immortality would be gathered. At that time they could kill the Hallmasters of the Taiyu Shrine one by one, or even wipe them all out. The dawn of victory was right in front of them. Unknowingly 2 hours had passed. The two Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality had caught up with the fifth Hall Master of the Taiyu Shrine. On the contrary, the somewhat pessimistic god of the underworld was at the back of the pack. He was still 40,000 miles away from them. The two Hall Masters of the Pantheon of Immortality had launched a siege on the fifth Hall Master. The two Hall Masters attacked from the left and right, using all kinds of supernatural powers and supreme techniques. The fifth Hall Master was dodging left and right, and he was in a difficult situation. After being besieged, the fifth Hall Master fought as he fled, but his speed had decreased by more than half. The two sides had only exchanged more than 30 blows, and the fifth Hall Master was already injured. Not only did his divine power shield collapse, but there were hideous wounds on his shoulders and back that kept bleeding. The fifth Hall Master was stalled and could not escape for the time being. No matter how slow the god of the underworld was, he had enough time to rush over. When he joined the battle and besieged the fifth Hall Master with the other two Hall Masters, the pressure on the fifth Hall Master suddenly increased, and the situation became very dangerous. The four people on the battlefield were all at the middle level of the God Emperor. 3 besieging one could imagine what the outcome would be. Only 100 breaths of time had passed, and the two sides had only exchanged more than 100 blows. The fifth Hall Master was severely injured and vomited blood. He was sent flying thousands of miles away. This time he was really panicking and felt the threat of death. Although he knew that he was not far away from the second Hall Master. As long as the second Hall Master arrived in time, he could still survive. But he could not be sure how long it would take for the second Hall Master to arrive. 15 minutes later? Or 100 breaths later? If it was more than 15 minutes, the fifth Hall Master would be in complete despair. He knew very well that he would not be able to hold on until then and would die on the spot. Therefore, the fifth Hall Master endured his injuries and did not hesitate to use a forbidden secret technique to stimulate his last bit of potential to escape. He did not want to tangle with the god of the underworld and the others. He only wanted to escape. But the more he wanted to escape, the more he could not. He was beaten up even more badly by the 3 people of the god of the underworld, and his injuries were even more serious. Chapter 4762. The fifth Hallmaster's injuries were getting more and more severe, and his combat ability was rapidly weakening. In another 20 to 30 rounds he would be killed by the combined forces of the god of the underworld and his 2 companions. The fifth Hallmaster was filled with despair and he thought that he was going to die. At this critical moment, a dazzling divine light lit up in the sky not far away, and it was speeding toward them like a shooting star. In just a few breaths, the divine light crossed 100,000 miles and rushed into the battlefield. The sudden arrival of the divine light carried a vast divine power, and an overwhelming and violent aura shrouded a radius of 30,000 miles. The god of the underworld and the 2 Hallmasters were shocked, and they subconsciously slowed down their attacks and put on a defensive and alert posture. The 5th Hallmaster, who was severely injured and on the verge of death, sensed the aura of the powerhouse, and he was ecstatic as if he had found a life-saving straw. 2nd Hallmaster. You're finally here, save me. The 5th Hallmaster, who was covered in blood, his clothes were ragged and his hair was messy. He waved his hands and let out a muffled cry. That's right, the divine light that rushed over was the 2nd Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine, and he had the strength of an upper-level god emperor. Even Ji Tianxing was no match for this person, and he had been severely injured and it was not easy for him to escape. The 2nd Palace Master came with a menacing aura, but he did not act recklessly. After he rushed into the battlefield, he intimidated the god of the underworld and his 2 companions, but he was not in a hurry to attack. While the god of the underworld and his companions were on high alert and slowed down their attacks, the 2nd Hallmaster released a divine light that filled the sky, and helped the 5th Hallmaster block most of the attacks. With his help, the 5th Hallmaster's pressure was greatly reduced, and he was in a much more stable situation. The 2nd Hallmaster used a few more divine skills to force the god of the underworld and his companions to retreat, and then he rescued the 5th Hallmaster. He protected the 5th Hallmaster behind him, and the 5th Hallmaster had a chance to breathe. He hurriedly channeled his energy to suppress his injuries and took a healing elixir. The god of the underworld and his companions recognized the 2nd Hallmaster and witnessed his strength. They were instantly stressed and they were frustrated. They knew that it was impossible for them to kill the fifth Hallmaster now that the second Hallmaster had arrived. They could only regret that they did not kill the fifth Hallmaster before the second Hallmaster arrived. The two sides were in a stalemate for a while, and the second Hallmaster asked the fifth Hallmaster if he could continue to fight. The fifth Hallmaster looked pained and hesitated and did not reply. Seeing his reaction, the second Palace Master knew that his injuries were too severe and he could no longer fight. The second Hallmaster of the Underworld and his companions, the fifth Hallmaster. Hallmaster of the Underworld, fifth Hallmaster of the Underworld and his companions. Swish, swish. Boom 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 boom. Rumble rumble rumble. The Hallmaster of the Underworld, and of the God Hall with the of the Hallmaster. Even though the second Palace Master was powerful enough to crush any one of the three, the second Palace Master was still very strong. However, the three Emperor Gods had joined forces to besiege him and it was still very troublesome for him. His hands and feet were tied and he couldn't unleash his full power. The second Hallmaster had dominated the land of origin for tens of thousands of years, and he only admired the God Emperor Tai Yu and the legendary ancestor. He was not even afraid of the founders of the other three God palaces. Now that he was besieged by three middle-level God Emperors, he was in such a passive position. Naturally, he was furious. However, he knew that this was the territory of the Pantheon of Immortality. If they were entangled for too long, the other party would attract more reinforcements. By then he would be besieged by more God Emperors and thousands of elite God Kings. It would be impossible for him to escape and he would die on the spot. Therefore, the second Hallmaster could only suppress his anger. After fighting with the God of the Underworld and his companions for a while, he fled into the distance. The God of the Underworld and his companions did not want to give up, and they began to chase after him. Their expectations had been lowered. Even if they knew that they could not kill the second Hallmaster, they had to find a way to injure him. The fifth Hallmaster was heavily injured and had lost his ability to fight. He would not be of any use in the short term. If the second Hallmaster was also heavily injured, the Taiyu Shrine's ability to fight would be reduced by nearly half. This was a great advantage for the Pantheon of Immortality. The two sides began to chase after each other in the night sky. They were like shooting stars streaking across the night sky, and soon disappeared into the horizon. Time passed quietly. Unknowingly, an entire night had passed. By daybreak, the distance between the second Hallmaster and the God of the Underworld and his companions had increased to 400,000 miles. He had successfully escaped the pursuit of the God of the Underworld and his companions, and he had escaped on the divine warship. The fourth Hallmaster was also on his way to help. If the fourth Hallmaster had arrived and joined forces with the second Hallmaster, they still had a chance to deal with the God of the Underworld and his companions. Even if they could not defeat the three of them, it would at least be a draw or even a slight advantage. However, after much consideration, the second Hallmaster still felt that this was not the right thing to do. There was no need for the fourth Hallmaster to show up. They had a more important mission at hand. Their primary goal was to capture Xianxia, and they could not get too involved with the Pantheon of Immortality. Just like that, the first confrontation between the two sides came to a temporary halt. The second Hallmaster sent a message to the fourth Hallmaster, and they agreed to meet somewhere. He had to regroup and bring the fourth Hallmaster and the fifth Hallmaster together. They could not split up again. Besides, he also reported the process and results of the incident to the God of the Underworld. On the other side, the God of the Underworld and the other two Hallmasters were not satisfied. Even though the second Hallmaster had shaken them off, they still searched the surroundings for 4 hours before giving up. After confirming that the other party had disappeared without a trace and that they could not catch up, the three of them turned back. They gathered together and reported the situation to the God of the Underworld before discussing the next plan of action. The second Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine is an upper-level God of the Underworld. We were able to suppress him and make him pay the price of light injuries. That's already good enough. Yes. For a powerhouse like him, it's normal that we couldn't catch up with him if he was determined to escape. No matter what, our operation was a success and it's worth celebrating. The fifth Hallmaster of the Taiyu Shrine is temporarily disabled, and the second Hallmaster was also injured by us, exposing his whereabouts. The first Hallmaster will definitely reward us for this contribution. At least we know that the second and fifth hall masters of the Taiyu Shrine are in this area. As long as we send reinforcements and increase our search efforts, we will be able to find them again. The two hall masters were gratified and satisfied with the results of this operation, and had already asked the first hall master for credit. However, the god of the underworld was not happy. He was still thinking about Kenshin. He only wanted to find Kenshin as soon as possible and use the power of the Pantheon of Immortality to eliminate him. As long as he could get rid of Kenshin, he would not hesitate to break off his relationship with the Pantheon of Immortality. As for helping the Pantheon of Immortality deal with the Taiyu Shrine, he was becoming less and less interested. In fact, to him the two shrines were the same. If there was a need, he could cooperate with any shrine without any psychological burden. In this way, the three god of the underworld had their own thoughts. After a short discussion, they could only continue their search. Chapter 4763. The god of the underworld and the two temple masters had severely injured the fifth temple master of the Taiyu Shrine, and also injured the second temple master of the Taiyu Shrine. The news still spread, but only among the temple masters of the Pantheon of Immortality. The temple masters who heard the news were very pleased and proud. After all, their three temple masters had made a great contribution, and they had also destroyed the prestige of the Taiyu Shrine. However, even though they were pleased, they were still worried and anxious. Even without the Pantheon of Immortality's announcement, the temple masters knew that the Taiyu Shrine's temple masters had arrived. Next, the two temples would go to war and the temple masters of both sides would fight and kill. Once the flames of war were ignited, the people of the Pantheon of Immortality would definitely suffer the most damage. Many of the branch hall masters were silently praying that their territories would not become a battlefield. When Ji Tianxing heard the news, it was already a few days later. At this time he had already arrived at Autumn Wind Ridge and was close to the Immortal Shrine. He knew that the Immortal Shrine was an empty city, and there was no god-emperor guarding it. But before he sneaked into the Immortal Shrine, he still patiently asked around in a nearby temple. As he heard the news just now. After hearing the news, he confirmed the approximate location of the god of the underworld. He collected many clues and analyzed the results, which proved that the god of the underworld and the immortal god of the underworld should not be together. This was a good thing for him, as it could ensure that his plan could be carried out smoothly, and the success rate was very high. The night was boundless. The famous Autumn Wind Ridge was located in a mountain range with a radius of millions of miles. There were endless ancient mountain ranges, rising and falling towering peaks, as well as lush and verdant primeval forests. The divine power of heaven and earth was very rich, and it often condensed into colorful clouds between the mountains. In the beginning, there were many powerful divine beasts and ferocious beasts in this area. However, after the immortal god emperor established his power and built his divine palace here, he gradually exterminated and dispersed these divine beasts. Now, Autumn Wind Ridge had also become a forbidden area. Without the permission of the divine palace, no one could approach without permission. Otherwise, their lives would be in danger. As Ji Tianxing traveled through Autumn Wind Ridge, he did encounter many defensive formations or trap-like formations. To God King powerhouses, those formations and traps were indeed troublesome to deal with. If they were careless, it would indeed be life-threatening. However, Ji Tianxing shuttled through them as if he was walking on flat ground. Deep into the night, everything was silent and the night sky was dark and moonless. Ji Tianxing arrived near the imperishable celestial palace and hid in the clouds, silently observing the entire palace. Not far below, at the peak of the mountain range, there were three giant peaks that were thousands of feet tall. The peak of the mountain had been flattened, turning into a flat land with a radius of 20 to 30 miles. Rows of palaces and buildings stood on the flat land. Under the curtain of night, the palaces and buildings were brightly lit, illuminating the entire place. At the peak of the three giant peaks, there were more than 60 palaces and more than 100 buildings. It was quite spacious to accommodate more than 10,000 living beings. Although the immortal god emperor and several hall masters were not inside the divine palace, the guards guarding the palace did not dare to be careless. However, the thousands of guards in the divine palace still did not dare to relax. They still firmly guarded the various palaces and residences, as well as the various passageways and gates. Even the various layers of defensive formations had been activated and were operating normally. Other than the God Emperor powerhouses, no one could force their way into the imperishable celestial palace. Even if the average God Emperor could break through several layers of defensive formations, they would not be able to enter the core area. After 2 hours of observation, Ji Tianxing understood the layout of the imperishable celestial palace, and also grasped the patrolling patterns of the guards. Moreover, he released his divine sense and used a secret technique to scan the entire imperishable celestial palace, making sure that there were no God Emperor powerhouses inside. At this time he landed on the main peak in the middle and began to activate his technique to break through the formation and sneak in. With Ji Tianxing's strength and methods, even when activating the formation he could suppress the fluctuations of his divine power to a very small degree. The patrolling guards could not detect anything unusual, nor could they imagine that someone would dare to sneak into the imperishable celestial palace at this time. Things were going smoothly. After half an hour, Ji Tianxing broke through the first layer of the defensive formation. He passed through the gap in the formation and entered the main peak, passing through a courtyard and continued forward. Soon he reached the second layer of the defensive formation and used the same method to break through the second layer. The same method, the same process, and the same result. Ji Tianxing successfully broke through the second layer of defense and slowly approached the core area of the imperishable celestial palace. Next he broke through the third, fourth, and fifth layers of the defensive formation. He finally entered the core area and snuck into the most sacred and majestic palace. Without the God Emperor's presence, he quickly searched through the palace's study rooms, secret rooms, and other important areas. He collected many clues as well as some secret techniques, books, and biographies. He even found the communication jade slip between the god of the underworld and the imperishable God Emperor. But these things were not very useful. Ji Tianxing decisively went underground and opened a secret passage to find the imperishable celestial palace's treasury. On the way to the treasury, there were many guards and deity kings guarding the gates. No matter how careful Ji Tianxing was and how he managed to kill 3 groups of guards without making a sound, he still alerted the 4th group of guards. It couldn't be helped, every checkpoint was very close to the treasury, and the guards guarding the treasury were the best of the best. Since he had been discovered by the other party, Ji Tianxing simply stopped pretending and started the massacre. He easily killed the guards and rushed to the entrance of the treasury. At this time, the commotion from the 2 sides had already alerted the guards of the imperishable celestial palace. There were shadows flashing all over the imperishable celestial palace, and there were even the sounds of weapons being unsheathed. Group after group of guards quickly gathered and entered the underground passage to check out the situation inside the treasury. Ji Tianxing's response was also very simple. He focused on studying the formation on the treasury's gate and tried to break it. Yun Yao and Ji Ku protected him and blocked the passage near the treasury's gate. When the first group of guards passed through the underground passage and rushed to the treasury's gate, the 2 of them acted decisively. This was because they were invisible and had concealed their auras. Those guards could only see Ji Tianxing and did not notice their presence, so they were not on guard. Thus, Yun Yao and Ji Ku succeeded and easily killed 8 guards without causing too much commotion. Then group after group of guards rushed into the underground passage to stop Ji Tianxing. But Yun Yao and Ji Ku used the same trick and waited for the exhausted guards to come, killing group after group of guards. However, the commotion caused by the killing became louder and louder, and the violent impact soon collapsed the underground passage, causing the palace on the surface to collapse as well. Chapter 4764. If the commotion was too big, more guards would be awakened and swarm over. Fortunately, Ji Tianxing used his fastest speed to crack the defensive array of the treasury's entrance. He rushed into the treasury and released his divine sense to cover the entire treasury to see if there were any ambushes inside. There were many defensive arrays, traps, and alarms in the treasury that was close to 10 miles in radius. There were no experts guarding it. As far as the eye could see, countless large chests were densely piled together, forming small hills one after another. There were also countless light balls floating in the dark sky. They contained all kinds of materials and some strange treasures. Ji Tianxing didn't waste time. He didn't carefully observe and estimate the value of the treasures. He directly used a capturing technique and put the small hills of boxes into his interspatial ring. While he was looting the treasures, many divine king guards passed through the collapsed palace and rushed into the rubble. However, Yun Yao and Jiku worked together to cast a spell and blocked all the guards, killing them one by one. The underground was too narrow and crowded. It wasn't convenient for a large-scale attack. Therefore, most of the guards stayed on the ground and formed a circle, waiting for their commander's orders. Only a small number of guards rushed into the underground and tried to stop Ji Tianxing from looting the treasury. However, they died in the ruins in the end. Soon 15 minutes passed. Ji Tianxing put all the treasures in the underground treasury into his interspatial ring. Then he led Yun Yao and Jiku through the ruins and returned to the surface. Swish, swish, swish. As soon as the three of them appeared in the night sky, divine light that blotted out the sky lit up in all directions. Thousands of divine light shadows poured down like a torrential flood. Ji Tianxing didn't need to look carefully. His divine sense covered the entire immortal palace and he already knew what was going on. With the collapsed palace as the center, more than 4,000 guards had already gathered in the night sky and formed two circles. Those guards were all elite divine kings. They were all wearing armor and holding swords and they were full of killing intent. Under the command of 3 peak stage divine kings, more than 4,000 guards attacked at the same time and used their most violent divine powers. Even though those guards had already verified that Ji Tianxing and his 2 companions were very powerful, they were still very weak. However, they had the advantage of numbers and many arrays to help them. They weren't afraid of Ji Tianxing and the other 2 at all. Infinite sky of chaos. The divine light shadows in the sky were about to hit Ji Tianxing and the other 2. At the critical moment, Ji Tianxing's body lit up with dazzling golden light. It instantly formed a light ball 100 feet wide, protecting him, Yun Yao and Jiku. The golden light shield not only had a strong defense, it also had Taoist rhyme. The 3 peak divine king realm commanders sensed the existence of the Tao aura. They were shocked and their faces were filled with fear. God Emperor. He actually has the strength of a God Emperor. The 3 commanders couldn't help but exclaim at the same time. In the next moment, the divine light shadows in the sky hit the golden light shield and there was a loud explosion. The golden light shield didn't move at all. It only rippled with layers of golden light, but there weren't any cracks. However, the tens of thousands of divine spell lights all collapsed, turning into billions of divine light fragments that scattered in all directions. The incomparably violent force of impact wrapped around the fragments of divine light that filled the sky, forming circle after circle of ripples that covered the entire mountain peak. Boom! Most of the guards who were nearby were sent flying by the shockwave. The palaces and mansions on the mountain peak were also blasted to pieces by the shockwave, turning into ruins all over the ground. In the midst of the mess, fire rose to the sky. Jiku, who was wearing armor and holding a divine spear, was like a phoenix flying in the sky. He spread his wings and scattered divine fire in the sky like a storm. The palaces and mansions that had already collapsed were turned into ashes in the divine fire, leaving only scorched earth and debris on the ground. The injured divine king guards could not escape the destruction of the nirvana divine flame. Not even their corpses remained. Their bones were reduced to ashes. At the same time, Yun Yao also swung her divine sword and shot out thousands of sword lights like moonlight in the night sky. Another few hundred God King guards were enveloped by the cold sword light. They were smashed to pieces under the moonlight. Blood splattered everywhere. Ji Tianxing also swung the Burial of Heaven sword and shot out hundreds of sword lights. Every ray of sword light pierced into a guard's head with unerring accuracy, destroying his sea of consciousness and shattering his godhead. The 3 of them killed almost 2,000 divine king guards in the blink of an eye. They didn't give the guards a chance to escape or hide. The guards were dumbfounded. The 3 peak divine king commanders were also scared out of their wits and were filled with despair. Although the battlefield was in chaos, many guards subconsciously retreated or even turned around to run. But the 3 commanders didn't lose their minds and still maintained a sense of propriety. They shouted loudly and ordered the guards under their command to maintain their formation. Most importantly, they took out their communication jade slips and reported what happened tonight to the immortal God Emperor and the Hall Masters. Chapter 4765. Of course, Ji Tianxing Yun Yao, and Jiku didn't stray too far from the immortal shrine. Ji Tianxing didn't stay idle after destroying the immortal shrine. He didn't even have the time to measure the value of the resources and wealth he plundered from the treasure vault. He led Yun Yao and Jiku to set up one divine formation after another around the indestructible divine palaces, mountain peaks and mountain ranges. For an entire month he did not rest or stop setting up the formation. With the immortal shrine as the center, he set up more than 60 divine arrays in a radius of 1,000,000 miles. These were all emperor-level divine arrays. Most of them were used to monitor the surroundings and detect the presence and traces of the god emperor. Only a dozen or so divine arrays could be used as traps and traps. This was the second step of Ji Tianxing's waiting for rabbit's plan. The first step was to destroy the immortal shrine and spread the news to force the immortal god emperor and the god of the underworld to return. The second step was to use the divine arrays to monitor the experts returning to the immortal shrine. Ji Tianxing had to figure out which god emperor would return to the immortal shrine before he could decide whether to act or not. If all 6 of the Pantheon of Immortality returned, then he could only wait for an opportunity to strike. If all the temple masters returned but the god of the underworld didn't, then he would leave the immortal shrine and go to the western region to seek revenge from the god of the underworld. After setting up all the divine arrays, Ji Tianxing finally had time to rest. He hid in a dark corner to recover his energy. During this month, 2 shocking battles occurred in the western region of the Pantheon of Immortality. Unsurprisingly, the 2 battles were related to the temple masters of the Taiyu Shrine. Previously, the god of the underworld and the others discovered the 5th temple master of the Taiyu Shrine and attacked him together, severely injuring him. Then the 5th temple master ran for his life and the 2nd temple master came to rescue him. After paying the price of minor injuries, he finally escaped the pursuit of the god of the underworld and the others. But this wasn't the end of it. The immortal god emperor brought the other 2 temple masters to the area where the incident occurred and met up with the god of the underworld and the others. The 6 temple masters discussed a plan and split into 2 groups to search for the Taiyu Shrine's temple masters. The 2nd temple master of the Taiyu Shrine was quite unlucky. He had just arrived at the predetermined location and met with the 4th temple master. Before they could leave the area, they were discovered by the immortal god emperor and the others. Thus, the immortal god emperor led 2 other hall masters to pursue the 2nd and 4th hall masters of the Cosmos Sacred Hall. The 2nd temple master was very strong, but he was no match for the immortal god emperor. In the process of the pursuit, the 2nd palace master and the 4th palace master were at a disadvantage. They were injured by the immortal god emperor and the others. They fled for tens of millions of li and spent an entire day, paying a heavy price, before finally escaping the pursuit of the immortal god emperor. But in the end, the 2nd temple master was the only one who managed to escape unscathed and meet up with the immortal god emperor and the others. The 4th temple master was also heavily injured and his strength greatly decreased. He wouldn't be able to participate in the battle for a while. The failure of the mission had caused the 4th temple master and the 5th temple master to be heavily injured and had to stay in the worship to recover. This was a heavy blow to the Taiyu Shrine. When the 2nd temple master returned to the immortal god emperor's side, the immortal god emperor was furious and heartbroken. They hadn't even found Ji Tianxing and they'd already lost 2 temple masters. If this continued, wouldn't the remaining temple masters be picked off one by the Pantheon of Immortality? They wouldn't be able to catch the chosen one, but instead help the Pantheon of Immortality. That would be a laughingstock. After calming down, the immortal god emperor decided to change their strategy. They still had to act in secret and search for Ji Tianxing, but they couldn't split up and let the Pantheon of Immortality pick them off one by one. The hall masters traveled together and searched for traces of Ji Tianxing along the way. They had to be even more cautious. If they ran into the Pantheon of Immortality again, they were confident they could kill them even if 2 or 3 of them worked together, as long as the enemy didn't come out in full force. Over the next half a month, Taiyu God Emperor personally led a few palace masters to various branches in the western region to conduct a search and investigation. With the immortal God Emperor overseeing the operation, their presence and traces were completely hidden. Even the immortal God Emperor and the god of the underworld didn't find anything after searching the area repeatedly. Not long after, the immortal God Emperor and the god of the underworld received news from the 3 commanders. When the palace masters found out that their lair had been destroyed by a few mysterious experts and burned down, they exploded with anger on the spot. The immortal god emperor was especially furious and almost vomited blood. This news was like a bolt from the blue. Without any hesitation, he immediately brought the two palace masters and rushed back to the immortal god palace without caring about anything else. They were going to tear the murderer into pieces. The immortal shrine was his life's work, but now it had been reduced to rubble. More than half of the guards and servants he'd left behind had been killed as well. Such hatred was absolutely irreconcilable. If he didn't grind the bones of the culprits to dust, he would never be appeased. The hall masters knew that the immortal god emperor would definitely rush back to the divine palace to take charge of the situation and take revenge after such a huge incident. However, the Taiyu Shrine's temple masters were still active in the western region. If they left without a care, the Taiyu Shrine's temple masters would take the opportunity to cause trouble. Two temple masters mustered up their courage and advised the immortal god emperor to reconsider. The immortal shrine had to send people back to take care of the situation, but 2 or 3 temple masters had to stay behind to keep the Taiyu Shrine in check. How could the immortal god emperor listen to such advice? He scolded the 2 temple masters who advised him and insisted on returning to the immortal shrine. Thus, the temple masters contacted the god of the underworld and asked him to persuade the immortal god emperor. When the god of the underworld heard the news of the shrine's destruction and read the description of the 3 culprits, he was so excited that he almost laughed out loud. Others might not know, but he was 100% sure that the culprits were Kenshin. He was worried that he wouldn't be able to find Kenshin, but he didn't expect Kenshin to show up and deliver himself to his doorstep. How could he not be overjoyed? If he could, he would take everyone back to the immortal god emperor and tear Kenshin to shreds. However, the temple masters understood that the immortal god emperor was angry and wanted to take all the temple masters back for revenge. This was irrational. In order to appease the temple masters and gain their trust, the god of the underworld could only compromise. He sent a message to the immortal god emperor stating that the culprits were Kenshin. Then he suggested that the immortal god emperor leave 2 temple masters behind to keep the Taiyu Shrine in check. He was willing to follow the immortal god emperor back to the shrine to kill Kenshin and take revenge. Chapter 4766. The immortal god emperor would listen to the god of the underworld's advice. At the very least, the immortal god emperor held him in high regard. The god of the underworld had analyzed Kenshin's actions and the Taiyu Shrine's movements. After the immortal god emperor received the message, he asked the netherworld god emperor why the sword god would do such a thing, since he was sure that the divine palace was destroyed by the sword god. The god of the underworld explained Kenshin's actions to the immortal god emperor through a series of flowery words. Of course, this also infuriated the immortal god emperor, causing him to hate Kenshin to the bone. In the end, the god of the underworld's goal was achieved. The 3rd and 5th hallmasters remained in the western region, responsible for keeping the Taiyu Shrine's hallmasters in check. The immortal god emperor brought the 2nd hallmaster, the 4th hallmaster, and the netherworld god emperor back to the immortal god palace as fast as they could to kill the sword god for revenge. It would take them a long time to reach the Taiyu Shrine from where they were. It would take them at least 2 months to reach the Taiyu Shrine on a divine ship. Fortunately, there were teleportation portals set up at several of the shrine's branches on the way back. The immortal god emperor and the 3 hallmasters could use the teleportation grand arrays of the branch halls to save a lot of time. In the end, it only took the 4 powerhouses a dozen days to reach Autumn Wind Ridge. The immortal god emperor and the god of the underworld had only left for a few days when another incident occurred in the western region. The 3rd and 5th hallmasters stayed behind, responsible for keeping an eye on the Taiyu Shrine's hallmasters and keeping them in check when needed. This wasn't a difficult task. After all, the Taiyu Shrine's 2 hallmasters were heavily injured and couldn't participate in the battle for a while. The only ones who could still move and fight were Emperor God Taiyu, the 2nd, 3rd and 6th hallmasters. If the 4 god emperors split into 2 groups and continued to operate in the western region, the 2 hallmasters of the Pantheon of Immortality would not be afraid. What they didn't expect was that Taiyu god emperor wouldn't split up in order to prevent the hallmasters from being taken out one by one. He personally led the 3 palace masters to search the various palace halls. Unfortunately, the third Hallmaster and the fifth Hallmaster of the Pantheon of Immortality met them during a search. The outcome was obvious. The two palace masters rushed forward excitedly to find out who the enemy was, only to find that there were 4 god emperors on the other side. What was even more frightening was that 2 of the 4 god emperors had reached the upper level of god emperor. The third Hallmaster and fifth Hallmaster were dumbfounded. Not only did they not dare capture the enemy, they even turned tail and ran. Taiyu God Emperor was calm and decisive. After confirming that there were only 2 god emperors on the other side, he gave the order to pursue them without hesitation. 2 of his palace masters had been heavily injured by the Pantheon of Immortality, and he still held a grudge against them. Now that he had the opportunity, he was going to take revenge. The 2 sides engaged in a chase and slaughter, causing a huge commotion in the area. Taiyu God Emperor only wanted to end the battle quickly. He didn't want to waste time and wait for reinforcements to arrive. However, the third Hallmaster and fifth Hallmaster were extremely cunning. They took advantage of the geographical advantage and sacrificed a large number of elite god kings and guards to delay Taiyu God Emperor's group. The 2 sides tangled for nearly 2 days. In the end, the third Hallmaster and fifth Hallmaster paid the price of heavy injuries and successfully escaped through the teleportation formation of their respective halls. No one on Taiyu God Emperor's side was injured. Only the palace masters had expended a large amount of divine power and were somewhat exhausted. They destroyed countless buildings and killed tens of thousands of civilians, as well as several thousand God King guards and elites. Even the headquarters of their respective halls had been reduced to rubble. After the 2 palace masters escaped, the Hallmaster destroyed the teleportation formation. After that, the Hallmaster fled with his guards and elites. Taiyu God Emperor's group arrived too late. They could only slaughter the guards and servants who didn't manage to escape in time and capture one of the vice Hallmasters. Not long after, Taiyu God Emperor's group calmed down and left the hall with the captives. They returned to the warship and entered stealth mode to secretly search for the other halls. Of course, the second Hallmaster obtained some information by interrogating the captives and even refining their memories. Through the vice Hallmaster's memories, the second Hallmaster learned of a very important matter. It was said that something shocking had happened at Autumn Wind Ridge in the central region of the Pantheon of Immortality. Several mysterious experts of unknown identities had destroyed the Palace of Immortality and slaughtered several thousand guards and servants, causing great panic. The Hallmasters of the various halls of the Pantheon of Immortality were filled with worry and trepidation when they heard the news. The second Hallmaster keenly realized where the problem lay and hurriedly reported it to Taiyu God Emperor. In a secret room on the warship, the second Hallmaster had an audience with Taiyu God Emperor. First Hallmaster, the Palace of Immortality has been destroyed by 3 unknown experts. Not only were several thousand guards and servants killed, but 3 peak God King commanders were also killed by the mysterious experts. Emperor God Taiyu blinked when he heard the news. Then he sneered proudly. Who else could it be but that kid? The second Hallmaster sneered. The second Palace Master was stunned for a moment and found it hard to believe. He subconsciously asked, "First Palace Master, you mean, the expert who destroyed the Immortal Palace is the person we are looking for?" Of course. Emperor God Taiyu looked confident and said with a playful smile, "There's no one else other than him. We don't have to search everywhere, just head straight for the Palace of Immortality. The Immortal God Emperor will help us find him." The second Palace Master was still a little confused. He asked again, "But I still don't understand. Why didn't that brat hide when he entered the territory of the Immortal Temple? Why didn't he appear again after everything calmed down? Not only did he show himself, he even caused such a huge commotion as if he was purposely trying to lure us here. Isn't that suicidal? With his intelligence and methods, there's no way he didn't think of this, right?" Taiyu God Emperor's smile didn't falter. He's quite strong and his intelligence and methods are top-notch as well. That's why he's very confident. He thought that he could take advantage of the chaos to lock onto his target and complete the mission. He might even be thinking of taking advantage of the situation, causing both us and the Pantheon of Immortality to suffer great losses. But he doesn't know that we in the Pantheon of Immortality aren't fighting like sandpipers and clams. He can forget about being a fisherman. The mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the aureole behind. Or that aureole. The second hallmaster was still worried, but he didn't say anything else after seeing Tai Yu God Emperor's confidence. He bowed to Tai Yu God Emperor and ordered the warship to change direction and head straight for the Palace of Immortality. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.